You said you had.
It's stable. They worked on it.
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, it should be. And I have my phone next to me, so I can switch to a hotspot.
So we will go, you know, the order, right? It will be Kim first, and then Federica, and then Sergio, and finally Patrick, who's not here yet, but I mean, I think we have time. I hope he's not. Maybe I should just double check my email just to see if he has a problem. So we will connect a little bit later. Can someone just close the door? Okay, I think we are actually recording. So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being patient with this hybrid format. So me and all the students are here in Delft, and all our guests are on Zoom, actually some even from the Netherlands. So I thought afterwards that you could have maybe come here, but I'm not sure how possible it is. But so everybody from around from the UK, the US, and the Netherlands on actually on Zoom. So thank you very much for accepting this invitation, the four of you. Today we have an afternoon mini symposium that is actually in conjunction with a seminar, a pro-seminar that is held here at the Berlage for the fall semester. So running from October all the way through January. And the pro-seminar is called Voices of the Recent Past. And it's a methodological seminar. So the first part of the program is called Cultures, Method and Instruments. And so it's part of this more methodological approach to architecture. And the seminar looks more particularly at the production of architectural discourse by institution during the postmodern era. And so we had with the students a series of reading seminars and lectures, but I wanted to invite a few specialists, which I will present in a moment, to talk about also widen a little bit the scope of the seminar. So architectural discourse, as we know, is as old as the discipline itself, but the period spanning from the mid-1960s to the early 1990s was characterized by a particularly intense production of discourse, be it written, visual, built, or oral. So in parallel to this multiplication of discourse during the postmodern era, new institutions came about, such as some of them we will hear about today, the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies in New York, the Canadian Center for Architecture in Montreal, the Deutsch Architecture Museum in Frankfurt, the Venice Biennale, and so on and so on. So all these institutions together contributed to intensified and diversified, further and globalized really the exchanges and discussions in and around architecture. So today what we are investigating with this seminar is really the role and the agency of these institutions on the disciplinary discourse that have yet to be fully considered, because obviously is, as the title of the seminar suggests, recent past. And because it's recent past, a lot of the protagonists of this history are still with us. And so our seminar really aims to expose these voices of the recent past by conducting a series of interviews. So the students were today, the 24 students from all around the world will, after today, go on a mission to realize interviews, conversations with protagonists of the postmodern period, be it architects, but also gallery owners, editors, educators, in different places of the world. And also I really encourage the students to try to look into a geographical zone that are located outside the sort of canons, which we will talk about today. We will really talk about the canons and the most known history, if you want. And then with the seminar, we try to investigate also other geographies and other places. So we have 4 guests today. I will just briefly introduce the 4, not the speakers, but the topics. So the first one to speak will be Kim Foster, who will lecture on the Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies, which is now a very known specialist. He wrote his PhD dissertation on the Institute. And Kim, in his talk, will explain how the Institute, by gathering East Coast architects and academics, or those passing through New York, and providing them with teaching, exhibition, and publication opportunities, acted as a nodal point in this globalizing architectural scene. So really, I think we will see with Kim how, you know, New York became really the center point for a few years of this nascent global discourse. Then we will hear Federica Vanuki, who Federica and I have followed each other for a number of years, because we wrote our PhDs more or less at the same time. And I wrote about the Venice Biennale and Federica wrote about the Milan Triennale. So of course, we always ended up in the same conferences and the same discussions. And so she will talk today about the Milan Triennale between the 1960s and 70s, and how the Triennale provided a structure, not simply to exhibit objects, interior or buildings, but also to produce architecture knowledge. So she will also show us how this institution was, you know, fundamental for the scene of architecture in Italy, and especially in the north of Italy. And then we will have Sergio Figueiredo, who will speak about the Netherlands Architecture Institute, or its prehistory, if you want. So then the NIE, the Netherlands Architecture Institute, was an institution that was created only in the 1990s, but by the merge of 3 previous institutions. So we will talk about these institutions and how they merge into that one main institution that we have today, that is really an instrument to confront contemporary Dutch architecture with history through the continuous discussion, and instrument to systematically foster architectural discourse, as well as exchange among architects, historians, academics, and hopefully also the general public. And finally, we will talk about the Architectural Association with Patrick Zamarian, who published very recently a book on the history of the AA with Lund Omfrey. Patrick will talk about a period in the 1970s when Alvin Boyarski became chairman of the AA, in a period in which the AA became really a venue where the parameters of such practice were challenged, the practice of architecture were challenged, where new theoretical positions were framed, and where, most importantly, the disciplinary boundaries of architecture itself were completely redefined. So the AA also in those years became a focal point and a nodal point for discourse in architecture. So without further ado, I will stop the screen, and I will let Kim maybe share the screen. And in the meantime, I will just introduce briefly. Kim Foster is, since 2019, a lecturer in architectural study at the University of Manchester, where he teaches and research as a member of the Manchester Architecture Research Group. And from 2016 to 2018, Kim was an associate director of research at the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal, where the archive of the Institute of Peter Eisenman are located. So that sort of makes perfect sense. He also organized at the CCA an exhibition educating architects on Kenneth Frampton's pedagogy, and also led a number of research projects. And His dissertation at the ETH Zurich, as I said, was on the Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies, and very importantly, and I think Kim might mention something about that, or it might come in the discussion after, he interviewed more than 100 individuals, fellows, and board member, and student, and people involved in the institute at the time. So Kim, thank you very much. And
okay, thank you, Lea Katrin, also for this kind of introduction and for the invitation to speak here in this context. I was asked by Lea Katrin to speak on this renowned New York Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, which lasted from 1967 to 1985 as a new kind of institutional network involving a variety of actors, including architects, academics, that were commissioned with work from public authorities, foundations, endowments, but also entered into collaborations with universities, museums, galleries, and publishers, and shaped reciprocal relationships produced by journals, newspapers, catalogs, and book series, etc. And I researched this through archival research and an oral history, and will hint to this in my presentation. So the Institute was often commemorated as one of those mythical places in the recent past where architectural theory and, not to forget, architectural historiography were pursued as an independent subdiscipline of architecture. There seems to be an unbroken interest in the figure of Peter Eisenman, the Institute's founding director, who always knew how to attract attention to himself by being a publicist and a provocateur. Those were the descriptions given, with formal building analyses, sculptural house designs, and poetic theoretical fragments. My long-term research, however, which began about 15 years ago as a dissertation project and shall culminate in a publication, I examined the Institute and its operations and structure, conditions, and impact as a paradigmatic example of a paradigm shift towards postmodernism and transformations in relation to architectural, institutional, cultural, discursive, and pedagogical practices of the 1970s in the United States and beyond. Concerned with the production of culture and knowledge at large, the politics of discursive authority, socio-cultural hegemony, pedagogy, normativity, and hierarchy, I argued that the Institute contributed significantly to intellectualizing the design, culturalizing the social, academicizing the educational, thus contributing to redisciplinize architecture after 1968. Taking the French school of institutional analysis as a starting point, I understood the Institute, first of all, as an institution. The naming suggests so, more precisely as a genuinely postmodern institution, organization, or group, and questions its practice according to an institutional as well as discourse analysis with regard to the four major institutional roles. That of a project and research office, of an architecture school, of an event space, and finally as a publishing house in relation to new forms of work or precarious labor and organization. That made the Institute's historical significance relevant to the specific context of globalizing architectural debate and education, such as the larger context embedded in developments in American politics, economics, and society, as well as specific social and cultural historical developments in the international landscape of academia, museums, and publishing. And nevertheless, I would also like this research to be understood as a kind of diagnosis of the present, since the Institute's influence on practice and discipline continues to reverberate today. And sorry, I need to go back to this page. I base my interpretation of the everyday relations at the Institute, the forms of work and organization, and the broader structures that conditioned and shaped the Institute itself on the study of original sources and as motions, reports, agendas, minutes, correspondence, budgets, etc. And in doing so, I drew on various theories such as Alan Turing's sociology of education, which you can see here as book cover, Manfredo Tafuri's critique of the neo-avant-garde, Pierre Bourdieu's sociology of literature and art, and Frederick Jameson's reading of postmodern cultural objects, including that of architecture. And moreover, I conducted the specific research for this project primarily at the CCA, where the Institute's archives are located, allowing insights into procedures and practices, processes and decisions, as well as other activities in New York and at architecture schools on the East Coast of North America. I went to Princeton, Columbia, and Yale, also to MIT for archival research. And then I conducted more than 100 on-site interviews with key players, both fellows and friends, then staff and students, stakeholders and contemporaries, to consider their individual motivations and contributions, as well as different outsiders' perspectives on the Institute. So in the following, I would like to discuss the Institute, which always presented itself as a novel, non-professional, extra-academic network founded at the beginning in cooperation with the MoMA and with Cornell University. Arthur Drexler and Colin Rowe were instrumental figures here, also with the support of the Graham Foundation, rather as a network of networks. The Institute, however, always subject to manifold changes over time, never stable, inventing itself over and over again about every 3 years due to the changing state of affairs. And since it defied institutionalization, it can rather be seen primarily as a project, and Eisenman accordingly as a project maker of some sort of postmodernism. My research on the Institute and its history raised questions about the historiography of institutions in architecture in general, about focalization and multi-perspectivity, also about the possibilities of writing a collective biography. After its founding in the fall of 1967, when it was immediately recognized as an educational institution and granted nonprofit status, the Institute provided a new network and working context for Eisenman and some colleagues to propose new approaches to urban renewal and housing, first of all, based on ownership and public-private cooperation as approaches. And commissioned by the city, by state and federal planning agencies alike, the Institute worked as a project office initially with students as laborers who were promised work experience here on research and design projects, and still keeping with Lyndon B. Johnson's policy of a great society. And here you can see a first report and publication on new urban settlements, actually new town developments, both in Britain and the US, carried out by the Institute. A complex network of collaborations then was quickly established with established universities and museums, various art and cultural institutions, public and private foundations, and influential and wealthy individuals. As a network, Eisenman was able to use the funds from the Graham Foundation in the early years to gather around him a circle of aspiring architects and academics, primarily from Europe and Latin America, who were all working on their own research in New York and who were to make careers at universities in the metropolitan region. Membership based on a meritocratic principle was awarded after a one-year probation period. And Eisenman reported to a board of trustees himself that legitimized then the Institute's activities, but also facilitated funding and represented external relations. After work for the City Planning Commission and the US Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Institute's greatest achievement, however, was to have designed a prototype of low-rise housing for the Urban Development Corporation of New York State, which was presented then as an alternative to the then discredited large-scale housing projects. Once again, the promise of an exhibition of the research results at the MoMA was attractive to all partners here. But the demonstration project realized in Brooklyn was ultimately to remain the Institute's only build project. For 1973 already brought a decisive turn then after the moratorium on public funded housing under the Nixon administration had put an early end to the Institute's efforts to have an influence on the urban environment. The move to new spacious quarters then, a double-story office suite in Midtown Manhattan, allowed the Institute to hold lecture series and first exhibitions, and the first one actually being a show on Soviet art and architecture, which was actually a traveling exhibition from Delft, curated by Max Risselada in the summer of 1971. This early form of culturalization became even more evident when the Institute in 1973, with the support of private institutional and corporate sponsors, launched the journal Oppositions, initially self-published, a print medium for conveying a truly postmodern debate that semanticized, historicized, and aestheticized developments in both modern and contemporary architecture by resurrecting an avant-garde attitude, as it was later argued by Manfredo Tafuri on the pages of this very journal, Oppositions, which, similar to the Institute, though, struggled to survive in those early years. For several years in a row, the Institute was on the verge of financial collapse, despite the ongoing construction project. A dual leadership was installed, with Peter Wolf teaming up with Peter Eisenman. And while counting on lending large sums for funding with research projects commissioned, for example, by the National Institute of Mental Health, set up by Peter Eisenman, Myra Gandazzonas, Diana Angrist, and research associates, on a linguistic structuralist interpretation of architecture in the city, which only received initial funding. Debt reduction, as you can see here from this structural diagram, was built into the funding model as a permanent fixture. The end of government-sponsored housing policy marked then a historic watershed in the life of the Institute, with profound changes both for the architectural and building worlds at large, but also the Institute in detail, whereupon education and culture then became key drivers. Beginning in 1974, under Eisenman's leadership, the Institute reinvented itself as an educational institution, seizing the opportunity and driven by the larger transformations of the American educational system, as well as the emergence of what in sociology became called the principle of lifelong learning. While the Institute's fellows taught concurrently in master and bachelor programs at one of the architecture schools in the region or pursued their own architectural practice, the Institute quickly developed and promoted a variety of educational offerings for different cohorts, which you can see here advertised on this leaflet. For example, an undergraduate program in architecture in collaboration with a consortium of liberal arts colleges in the northeastern United States that Eisenman had specifically re-established at the initiatives of the Sarah Lawrence College, which was located just outside of New York City. Also, a commercial internship program that mentored graduates who came to the Institute to work under one of the fellows, primarily Eisenman, in building up a portfolio, and the Institute supported them in issuing letters of recommendation and thus placing them in new graduate programs. or even a high school program for junior architects, a successful offering under Deborah Berg and Lawrence Kotnicki. In addition to history and theory courses, which was the Institute's interpretation of the liberal arts curriculum, taught by Kenneth Frampton, Mario Gandolsonas, and Anthony Vidler, at times by Peter Eisenman, undergraduate students were taught in planning, in construction, and also in design. And good relations here were maintained with the Cooper Union, where Eisenman taught, since students were granted special conditions. And further teaching staff then, who taught studio for a term or for a year, such as Rim Koolhaas, Bernard Jumi, or Graham Shane, were poached from the AA in London, New York, and the Institute being here an entry point and being attractive for them. The Institute was in short time then transformed from a closed circle of fellows to a public place in Midtown Manhattan. Awarded by the American Institute of Architects in 1976 for its educational offerings, the Institute successfully positioned itself nationally as an interface then between colleges and universities, although it could not bring itself to offer a master program, which was discussed at one point in collaboration with Sarah Lawrence. What counted more was that tuition revenue funded much of the Institute's operating budget for years to come. And in the end, although no real degree program was ever offered there at any point, the Institute ended up competing with Ivy League architecture schools, with Columbia, Harvard, MIT, and Princeton for students and staff. With the advanced design workshop led by Diana Agres, the Institute finally surrendered to the exclusive teaching of a postmodern design in its first year, quite glamorously stuffed with Charles Guathmey, Aldo Rossi, Robert Stern, and Ohm Unges. And overall, the Institute found itself again in the midst of a move towards the academicization of architectural education, reflected in new master's degrees, bachelor degrees, and doctoral programs in architecture. In the process, the diversification, intellectualization, and also internationalization, and even commercialization of the educational landscape in the US was a new trend to which the Institute contributed significantly. At the same time, the Institute, as an event space that competed with the major museums in terms of audience and with alternative spaces in the arts in terms of funding, had a lasting impact on cultural production in architecture, understood as a material that is non-material labor. And starting in 1974, so in parallel to the educational programs, the Institute, organized by Andrew McNair, hosted an ambitious evening program with lectures every night for 6 years, an almost unbelievable number. Robert Stern, here well connected as president of the Architecture League, was given a crucial role as advisor and moderator. And while the fellows regularly moderated or lectured themselves, Eisenman often hosted the evenings as MC. By combining high and popular culture, lecture series on architectural history and theory, or on new positions in architecture, in the arts, and in design, the Institute addressed a broad audience and made a decisive contribution to New York's architecture culture. Another format was the New Wave series, which first presented positions from European architecture, for example, by Ohm Unges, Rem Koolhaas, Elias Singelis, Massimo Scolari, Carlo Imonino, Robert Krier and Leon Krier, Jürgen Savade, Aldo Rossi, and Ohm Unges again. And then the national scenes also from Japan and from Austria. An event on the Berlin Builders did not take place, nor did those positions from Switzerland, Spain, and Latin America. But I think this shows the breadth of what the Institute perceived as relevant in architecture in those days. And in addition, beginning in 1975, an independent exhibition program was established and successively expanded, in the context of which representatives of postmodernism who were pushing into the foreground, such as protagonists of modernism who had fallen into oblivion, were shown with funding, for example, from the National Endowment for the Arts. alongside architectural drawings of Aldo Rossi or Massimo Scolari, for example, in the 1976 exhibition Ideas model elevated the architectural model to the status of a work of art. The poster in limited editions and the exhibition catalog, which was years in the making, underscored this. Then theorizing the status of the model, giving cultural valence to it in the shifting art market with the Max Protege Gallery and Leo Castelli Gallery exhibiting architects in those days. At its 10th anniversary, 1977, as Eisenman reconceived the Institute as a cultural resource, it had reached its peak. The Institute had opened up to the humanities, not least to apply for a large grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities for Open Plan, a new series of events. And the $350,000 grant was hailed in the New York Times on the architecture pages as the event of the year by Paul Goldberger. Management and curation now dealt with very different kinds of capital. And communication and development were expanded into separate departments, so the Institute professionalized. With the Architects Circle, a circle of friends and supporters was established in accordance with the North American practice of cultural philanthropy, that is private patronage. Through the most synergetic, ultimately profitable use of virtually all of its programs and products, the Institute was able to operate independently in a short period of time during the bicentennial, when arts and culture funding was made available under the Carter administration, thus expanding its sphere of influence. In the process, the Institute adapted its programming in such a way that it now served the market of a symbolic economy, or what Georg Frank once called the economy of attention, not least through its close association with the thriving gallery scene and art market. Yet despite new intellectual spheres, many important issues of the time were not addressed properly, such as the economic and ecological crisis of the 1970s, the dismantling of the welfare state thereafter, and the privatization of cities, or the globalization of politics, economics, and culture. In the second half of the 1970s, the Institute, financed by its work as an educational and cultural institution, concentrated on increasing its media presence, and in addition to opposition, introduced new publication formats that were edited internally by fellows and produced primarily by female staff, thus operating virtually as a publishing house. So in 1976, MIT Press, as a renowned publisher, was finally found for Oppositions 5, which legitimized the academic aspirations of the journal. The signing of the contract here led to the internationalization of distribution and advertising, while professionalization of editorial and journalistic work was ensured by the addition of Anthony Vidler to the editorial staff. The Institute then gained in importance by being able to decisively expand its publishing portfolio. From 1976, in addition to Oppositions, it first published the journal October, which has since driven art theoretical and critical discourse. And then from 1978 onwards, the monthly architectural newspaper Skyline, with interviews and reviews of events. As much as the exhibition catalogs with documents and essays. And Philip Johnson, who had long acted as an eminence grise, was now increasingly courted and featured as a figurehead, among other things, with a catalog and the AT&T building, listed here in this flyer as catalog 9, but published first before the deal with MIT Press. Also for the catalog series was made. The content of Oppositions at the Institute shifted more and more towards architectural history due to changes in the composition of the editorial staff and the zeitgeist in general, that is the cultural intellectual climate of the days. The Opposition book series, that is monographs of architects by historians and theorists, was introduced in 1981. as a large format with the goal of doing nothing more than shaping the curriculum of architecture in the long term. And on the poster, you still see Kenneth Frampton's collection of essays, Labor, Work, and Architecture, already announced here, which only later was published by Phaidon Press. After oppositions had repeatedly published, Manfredo Tafuri Aldo Rossi was published twice as an author with 2 books, the English translation of The Architecture of the City, and the first publication actually of a scientific autobiography. Also, Tafuri's The Sphere and the Labyrinth, already contracted by the Institute, did not make it into the series though. In the early 1980s, when the Institute had to turn to the corporate world for private sponsorship in the wake of the conservative turn in society and politics, and even considered a conference on architecture's relationship now to the building and real estate world for a time to conclude its humanities sponsorship, Skyline's relaunch, especially Eisenman's interviews with developer architects, became its most important fundraising tool. And here you see a fundraising dinner on the occasion of the relaunch. Editor Susan Stevens being the only woman, herself, Eisenman and Widler there to court the invited guests for funding. If MIT Press long supported the Institute in terms of almost all its publications, eventually the switch to Rizzoli International, pushed through by Eisenman, meant that they now had to exist in the broadening magazine and book market, an effort that remained short-lived and was eventually discontinued in 1983. And in the end, the Institute died a slow death, closing its doors in 1985 after several attempts to make it economically viable were doomed to failure following Eisenman's resignation in 1982. The attempt to establish what was called the Philip Johnson Center of Architecture, into which the Institute should have been absorbed, which was initiated in 1981, but ultimately failed, is a revealing case here. And in addition to a fundraising phase, the goal was $10 million. The project also included a building project to acquire a landmark building in Manhattan to counteract the rising rent. It was envisaged that in addition to the Institute, the Philip Johnson Center would have also housed an archive, a museum, a research library, and a research center. The name Philip Johnson attached did not help to achieve the campaign's goal, while his fascist past did not seem to make a difference, which was already known back then, but institutionally not properly addressed at that time. Instead, the Institute looked to Montreal, where Phyllis Lambert started to conceive the CCA, which got a postmodern home some years later, and which today includes diverse archives, not only of the Institute, but also of individual fellows, such as Peter Eisenman and Kenneth Frampton, and possibly soon of some other protagonists of the Institute. And thus, like the NIE or the Deutsch Architecture Museum or the Getty research facilitates further architecture research. So to conclude, if I have like 2-3 more minutes, an institutional and discourse analysis of the Institute demonstrates that the collective biography of a network allows for a very different architectural history of knowledge and cultural production than a biographical approach, with narratives that can include a wide variety of founding myths, ruptures, turning points, and endings, depending on the perspective. Returning to the Institute's various innovations, focus on its organizational and programmatic restructuring helps to understand that architecture's cultures, attitudes, behaviors, beliefs and values, worldviews, and ultimately models of society are always territorially and culturally constituted and historically conditioned. And essential in this recognition is that the Institute had to reinvent itself repeatedly to adapt to social reality with the 4 dominant roles of project and research office, architecture school, event space, and publishing house, alternating over time, at times mostly overlapping though. And this might have led Reinhold Martin in Utopia's Ghost, Architecture and Postmodernism again, to have characterized the Institute as an apparatus, a teaching machine next to a discourse machine. And Manfredo Tefuri, writing in 1976, to have recognized the Institute as one of the well-defined cultural spaces without really following up on this. Eventually, the Institute provided for its own history, and I would like to close with this. Be it Eisenman in a 1976 interview with Alvin Boyarski in front of the cameras at the AATV studio, the Institute with its brochure of 1979, or then in Skyline with a dual article from the perspective of Kenneth Frenton and Susan Stevens on the occasion of its 15th anniversary. However, the Institute never fully institutionalized, and this was strategy, as Eisenman repeatedly resisted institutionalizing the educational programs in his role as director. And as a culmination in 1982, at the end of his 15-year tenure, he stated that the Institute had so far failed only to prepare for the next step, this very transition into a true institution, the Phillips Johnson Center, another project with which he was to fail. The project character then of the Institute, positioned as a kind of anti-institution that gradually distinguished itself from the museums and university, manifested itself not only in the clear temporal demarcation of the individual programs, projects, and products, but also showed itself above all in the new material forms of labor. And this should shed light on the extent to which the Institute, as a place of research, teaching, lecturing, exhibiting, and publishing, changed not only the concept of architecture, but also the professional image of architects. As the fellows positioned themselves as theorists and historians, performed as artists and intellectuals, increasingly worked as cultural producers, and in the process managed themselves as entrepreneurs. So at the dawn of neoliberalism, an era in which flexible and creative projects became the guiding principle of any activity, the Institute's focus on research, education, culture, and editing allowed the ambivalences and paradoxes of alternative institutions, organizations, and groups to emerge clearly. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, maybe normally we will have a discussion at the end, but because Kim has to leave us before he's actually teaching this afternoon, so I just think we can take 5-10 minutes to maybe take 1 or 2 questions before going to our next speaker. So I don't know if someone, yeah, okay, I had something prepared, but a student has a question, so. Go ahead. Maybe you come a bit closer to the camera just to. Maybe in the meantime, I will ask a question to Kim. I just wanted to see if you could say a few words about also your use of oral history for this project. So, as I said in the introduction, you did an impressive amount of interview, and I remember meeting you for the first time in New York, where we were both going around interviewing everybody. So how did it help you to maybe demythify the institute? Because we know also that there is a big myth, or already a story around it. So how did it help or shape your research maybe to use oral history?
Sure, I'm happy to respond to this. Since I did all those interviews, I mean, primarily, first of all, to get to know about involvements and motivations, and understand who was in there, when, for what, because this is quite difficult to see. I mean, in the archives, you see lists of fellows that reappear on letterheads, for example, but also of teaching stuff advertised. But it is really difficult to understand who was the core group of an institute, who was actually doing work on the different programs, and at what time, people moving in and out. As I said, it was a 17 years period, which is a long period for such an institution or for such a group to actually exist. And so I think to understand better those individual involvements, it was essential to also then go back to the archives and read the documents again. And there's blank spots of the Institute, not only, for example, the initial years, but also the ending years, and even this very year, 1976, which I wrote about for the book that you published together with Veronique. Somehow this year, 1976, is barely covered in the archives. So to understand what actually happened in those times where there's no archival evidence of activities given, I think it was important to understand how different individuals related at what time. But as I said, it was a closer circle of friends that grew up to the number of 25, but it was also more layers. And the Institute, I think, I once tried to count the students that went through it. I think it was a couple of hundred, up to 1,000 over the years, basically. So I think it was important to listen to quite different perspectives of what the Institute meant to each individual.
We watched here the film, The Making of the Avant-Garde. We had the chance to have access to the film. So I think student already had an idea of how sort of multivocal this institute was as well, and how different people talk in different ways about it.
Just as a footnote, I mean, there's people in there who basically never had an official role at the Institute, while others in official roles were not interviewed. And I mean, it's always difficult to get all reasons, but there's politics around our histories, of course, that we need to take into consideration. And I couldn't speak to everybody I wanted to, or everybody who had been involved in, but in general, I was well received, of course, since there's also an interest to have stories heard.
Thank you. Nigel had a question.
Yes. Hello, Kim. My name is Nigel. Thank you for the presentation. I have a question. You mentioned, well, you presented an article that says the Architecture Institute was a mecca for students. So my question is, do you have in mind any names of students that later in their career had a significant contribution in architecture?
I mean, there's many, and of course I spoke to many. I didn't speak to all, and I couldn't trace all the professional lives that came out of the Institute, but there were people within the realm of the Institute that also made other steps at the Institute. And one, for example, is Joan Ortman, who started as an intern and then continued her life at the Institute as an editor. And this has been recovered, for example, also by finding her reports on her internship at the Institute. And I think, I mean, there's many more, and I wouldn't do justice if I just name a few. I think the case of Joan Ortman, and she goes back to it and actually made also somehow part of her reflection on this upbringing at the Institute with her work on architectural education, for example, and the book that she published, but also the conferences that she has been involved in. So, of course, it is curious to see, I mean, we shouldn't forget that also architects started to make a career, whether the Institute was that influential or whether it was being exposed to New York, to schools, having a job to earn a living, but also getting funding for books. Raymond Kuller's Delirious New York was funded out of New York, for example. I think that is essential to understand, to not only take it for granted, but to see the mechanisms that a culture somehow produces and that allow for multiple careers to strive.
Also someone like we mentioned here, Deborah Burke, because some students wanted to interview her and then were a bit surprised that she was actually involved in the Institute. I think she was quite young, right, when she joined.
She was very young and took on this task of the high school program that is often overlooked. I mean, high school education for architects is a topic that I looked into with an essay that I published in various institutions. And the institute wasn't the first one, but it took it to, I think, another level by actually offering this program. I mean, it was a commercial program. Students had to pay for it, but I think it educated a range of high school students in the arts, and some actually made a career of this, being exposed to architects and architecture for the very first time. And Deborah Burke, together with Lawrence Kutnicki, for I think a couple of years, 3-4 years, took on this task. And it was a project that was first developed by Andrew McNair upon the call of Peter Eisenman, and then transformed into a regular program somehow. And I think it was essential for Deborah Burke, although she faced, of course, this male society at the Institute, which she also talks about. And I think we have to consider that the New York architecture culture in those days was transforming majorly in terms of gender roles too.
Thank you. Someone else has a question for Kim? We have another few minutes if you want to. I mean, you're all expert in the IAUS now after hearing me and the film and Kim. So maybe I was quite surprised. I didn't know about this, or I didn't know much about this Johnson, or this idea to transform it into Philip Johnson.
That's a story that has not been told often. And the story of the ending has been only looked at briefly. I mean, back then, for example, in the University Journal of Columbia University in Percy, and it has never really made it into architectural history, why and how the Institute ended. And I mean, there's multiple approaches, individual, collective, institutional. I think, first of all, and this has been covered by an interview that was published in AA Files by Tom Beaver, Eisenman made this capital campaign somehow for transforming the Institute into this proper institution, which is countering all the previous strategies of how to run the Institute. This is what I find interesting. And I mean, the role Philip Johnson took on and was somehow also produced out of the Institute, especially Eisenman having an interest in playing with Johnson, I think is crucial to understand. But yeah, the question, of course, to ask what the Institute have become is arduous to ask, but why didn't it happen, and what happened to the Institute? Why did it end? And I think this is more important. There's multiple attempts to revive it, and there was a webpage once that it was like run as an institution out of the back offices of Kevin Cannon. So somehow there's also different stories that came out of the Institute, but eventually it closed down out of financial reasons. Funding was withdrawn, especially the funding of Philip Johnson. Eventually, in Michael Sorkin, the late Michael Sorkin played a crucial role in there, being a critic of the Institute, and especially this relation to Philip Johnson over the years.
Thank you. Sergio had a question.
Yes. Hi, Kim.
Hi.
Thanks for your presentation. I'm just going to give you a heads up before I start asking my question that there's construction next door, so you might hear some demolition hammers working.
I have colleagues speaking next door, so no worries.
Well, I cannot hear them. Okay, so my question is pretty simple. I wonder if you could relate this need for the IAUS to reinvent itself to the sources of funding. If there's, because you seem to sort of imply through your presentation that there was a relation, depending on which type of funding they would get, they would sort of come up with a different idea to keep the Institute going. But also, as you mentioned, in the end, it was a lack of funding that doomed the Institute, right?
Of course, I mean, an institute has to have a budget, a running budget, whatever it is. And I mean, the question is, to what extent is it a public institution or more private endeavor? And I think this is where differences are made. But as I mentioned, there's this culture of philanthropy in New York that has to be understood as part of the game. While I think the 1970s were a period where cultural funding grew, where, for example, the New York Council of the State of New York York on the arts was funding other alternative art spaces that grew out of New York that are still around, Artist Space and others somehow, also PS1 receiving fundings with an own architecture room. So somehow there's alternative models how to like use this funding and how to invest it. But I basically come back to this question often and often again, because I think it says something about the very like constitution and imaginary around what the Institute as an institution in the name could do and could be. And thus, I think this shift that has been often theorized and historicized to culture and to education is important to understand, because the Institute did so before, but it's not that it is something given somehow. While major institutions have been around, I think this shift is like quite significant for the 1970s to happen. And with the funding, of course, something bigger, something larger than the sum of its parts could have been made. And thus, I think this, both the educational programs, which brought people to New York and back and forth on many ends, as much as the cultural programming in its interplay, producing audiences, producing new knowledge somehow in both directions is essential to understand.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Kim. We will go to the second talk. So it was nice to have at least a little bit of time to discuss. If by any chance your teaching ends earlier, you can always join us back or stay for, I don't know how long.
I'm afraid it's 3 hours and I have
I know.
to hold. So please excuse. I'm happy to answer emails. Thanks again.
But thank you very much for your contribution. Our next speaker is also, I have to thank her because it's quite early. I know actually you're in Europe, right? You're not, no, okay, sorry. I thought you were in New York. So Federica Vanuki is both a licensed architect and an architectural historian, and she teaches currently at Pratt School of Architecture in New York, where she teaches global history and theory of architecture. But she is specialized in different topics such as architectural pedagogy. You participated to the Radical Pedagogy Project, architectural exhibition, political theory, and environmental design. As I mentioned before, Federica's main specialty, or she wrote her PhD dissertation on the Milan Triennale, and I was pleased to read here that there's a book manuscript, A Disciplinary Mechanism, the Milan Triennale 1964 to 1973 in progress. So we are all looking forward to the book that traces the sort of laboratory and testing ground that reshaped the relationship of architecture in both the theoretical and practical dimension at the Triennale during those years. So they are very important and intense year at the Triennale, which is what you will talk about today, I think. So, Federica.
Thank you very much for having me, Leah Catherine, and thank you for everybody that is participating today. So I will go ahead and share my screen. Let's see if you can see. Can you see it?
Yeah, now we see, oh yeah, now it's perfect.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so today, I will speak briefly about the history of the Triennale, just to orient ourselves, and then I will focus on the subject of today. During its first 6 years of existence, the Milan Triennale was located in Monza, founded in 1923 during the Mussolini's regime as International Biennial of the Decorative Arts. The first four exhibitions took place at the Villa Reale in Monza. After 1930, the Triennale was relocated in Milan, where it was housed in the newly built Palazzo dell'Arte designed by architect Giovanni Muzio. Both its new name and location led to a radical restructuring of the Milan Triennale. From a semi-independent private entity, it became a public institution. And this is actually also very interesting to see a public institution after we have been talking about instead a private one with the institute. So I, with the intent of exploiting culture through the design of objects, interiors, and architecture, and using it to control people's taste and behavior, Mussolini subjected the Milan Triennale directly the state through the establishment of a political committee that oversaw the Triennale organization, and we'll speak about that in a moment. The fifth Milan Triennale in 1933, which was the first one in Milan, entitled Style, Civilization, a label coined by Gio Ponti, aligned itself with the ideology of the fascist regime, while the Palazzo dell'Arte promoted the style of both rationalism and the more traditional Novecento, neoclassical style. The sequences of the soberly decorated interiors of the Palazzo dell'Arte describe the architecture of the modern Italy envisioned by Mussolini. Yet, with the end of World War II in 1945, after Mussolini's fall, the Milan Triennale turned into a democratic country's institution overnight. From 1930s to the early 1970s, no architectural biennials or triennials held as important a position in Europe as did the Milan Triennale. Since its inception in Milan, the Triennale has been the first and only permanent exhibition of architecture recognized by the International Bureau of Expositions, the intergovernmental organization responsible for regulating world's fairs since 1928, that was established in Paris. Its primacy declined only with the inauguration of the first international architecture exhibition of the Venice Biennale dedicated to the presence of the past in 1980. As the oldest architectural exhibition of its kind, the Milan Triennale had invented a model which was not simply to exhibit, but also to generate architectural experiments. The production of these experiments was discussed throughout the preparation period by two committees. The study center, along with the executive council, both made up of architects responsible for organizing the various venues, and the administrative council, a political committee that oversaw the Triennale's activities, directly responding to the Italian Parliament and the city of Milan. Over the years, the preparatory meetings of these entities included a striking array of architects, designers, critics, and historians, alongside with industrial patrons and policy makers. So today we will talk about one of these meetings, keeping in mind that these meetings today exist in a form of transcripts. This meeting happened in the beginning of the 1966 and is one of the instances where it becomes clear how the Milan Triennale was a space for debating and informing architectural knowledge and not only exhibiting architecture. So in the evening of 11 March 1966, Giancarlo De Carlo, Aldo Rossi, and Marco Zanuso, among others, gather at the Palazzo dell'Arte, the historic site of the Milan Triennale, to discuss the forthcoming 14th exhibition of the venue, to be celebrated 2 years later. As the discussion developed, the Cultural Committee, the so-called Study Center, finally decided to dedicate the event to the architecture of the greater number. And so here you see one of the meetings of the study centers, not exactly the one that we will talk about, but still gives a sense of the atmosphere and also the tension now that there is within this room, all these architects in this case and designers that are discussing what the next Triennale would be, but most likely what architecture is and should be. So the greater number was the architecture of the growing number of people populating the planet, of the large number of products utilized by a consumer-based society, of the increment of urbanized land, of the abuse of natural resources, and of the excess of waste produced by an economy of extraction. Importantly, the discussion on the March meeting came to disclose architecture's limitations within a rediscovered environmental fragility, the inadequacy of existing terms and reasonings defining the designer's space of action, its limits, its quality, and whose right was to intervene in it. So turning the discussion into a discipline one, the terms city, territory, habitat, and environment, in its Italian translation of ambiente, seemed unable to describe the complexity of an ever-changing social and economic context in relation with a new ecological awareness. As it unfolded, the discussion that took place that evening is a fundamental piece of the history of the ecological debate in Italy of the late 1960s. Yet, what the meeting at the Palazzo dell'Arte ultimately expressed was architects' struggle between two radically different understandings of architecture. In the Palazzo dell'Arte, the new ecological thinking applied to architecture passed through a fundamental disciplinary issue, one that questioned whether architecture was an autonomous field of knowledge or, on the opposite, a space of inquiry in a constant state of redefinition by external factors and sciences. Between disciplinarity and interdisciplinarity, historicity and militancy, architecture's own specificity was measured against the problems of the world it was constructing. As expected, Rossi used the term architecture of the city, which related to the history of social and political relationships, but it was not affecting nor affected by the immediate contingency of these relationships. As Rossi had noted in his book, The Architecture of the City of the same year, I quote, "Architecture is deeply rooted in the formation of civilization, and it is a permanent, universal, and necessary fact," end quote. While both Rossi and De Carlo believed that architecture of the city was shaped by social, political, and economic exchange among its inhabitants, they differed significantly when it came to the relationship between the city and history. For Rossi, the structure of the city, as determined by the urban fact, survived the power relationships that had initially determined its form. The structure of the city was, in fact, permanent. De Carlo instead felt that the form of the city was the result of constant negotiation between individuals' actions and the built and unbuilt environment. Thus, while Rossi's project aimed at reconstructing an urban structure that had been disrupted by ill-fitted buildings, De Carlos responded to the city as if it were a space in a permanent state of change. Rossi's position was at odds with the concerns expressed by the members of the study center and later in the exhibition. At the meeting, there was a general understanding that the city was, if anything, a relational term. It existed in its relationship between buildings and people, objects and processes. The boundaries between design products, buildings and cities were often porous. Discussions at the study centers reverted persistently to the ways in which the three disciplines, industrial design, architecture, and urban planning, related to mass society and mass consumption. As product designer Alberto Rosselli argued, architectural design, architecture, and urbanism had been subordinated to the same processes of production and market logic. This subordination was the reason why architects had to rethink the boundaries of the three disciplines. While Rossi understood architecture as a historical fact, Rosselli viewed it as a product of technology. Following Rosselli, art and architectural critic Gillo Dorfles added that the Trinale could not escape the tension between mass production and the making of a socially responsive architecture. For him, this problem had to be addressed from the scale of the object to that of regional planning. Dorfles emphasized the fact that mass production had affected architecture in quantitative terms, and this could no longer be ignored. In other words, architects, designers, and critics were trying to understand how an economy of consumption had affected the urban space, as clearly expressed by an earlier issue of Edilizia Moderna in 1964, while directed by Vittorio Gregotti, into which making both Rosselli and Dorfles contributed. The question of the object and its production was also addressed by Zanuso. While discussing the exhibition theme at the March meeting, Zanuso disagreed with Rossi's view. He understood architecture for its technological performance. Buildings function as any other industrial product. An industrial object required a framework of production, accumulation, distribution, and usage. In other words, a network of organization. Such a network implied that objects moved into an occupied space. Addressing Rossi's concerns directly, Zanuso claimed that, in a quote, a tighter relationship among objects, functions, and environment would allow the architect to overcome the misinterpretation of the autonomous nature of the object, end quote. The industrial object was not an autonomous entity because it was a product of an environment, and at the same time, it created an environment. In conversation with SIAM, of which he had been a member, and most importantly, with the members of the SIAM that will become the Team 10, Zanuso understood environment as meaning, and I quote, a habitat, a context formed by elements mediating the individual's relationship with the surrounding space, end quote. In other words, the environment included man-made objects that mediated the relationship between man and space. Reacting to Zanuzzo's words, De Carlo stated that the architectural object from product design to cities did not simply affect the abstract, in his view, environment. It also affected the organization of the territory. At the study center meeting, De Carlo's choice of words did not pass unnoticed, especially in comparison to Zanuzzo's. The substitution of environment with territory was definitely central to De Carlo's argument, although both implied an extension beyond urban limitations. Environment had an abstract dimension, while territory was concrete and, more importantly, implied the question of possession. Simply put, the Italian word ambiente derives from the Latin ambiens, which means to go around. The term territorio instead comes from the Latin territorium, a compound that referred to a land owned by an agent. It was exactly this last issue of ownership that De Carlo implicitly emphasized, as he believed that the architect's principal responsibility was to organize the contested territory, the ground of economic and political dispute. De Carlo concluded that the program of the next Triennale could be that of architecture for the greater number. It is no longer an action towards an object, but towards a totality. Thus, the theme of the 14 Triennale finally came to be. But, however, what did De Carlo mean by greater number? Because De Carlo used for instead of the greater number, he meant, at least in the March meeting, a larger number of individuals. While proposing the theme, De Carlo certainly had in mind discussion on the plural number, yet the context of the Triennale was very different from that of the museum. Coined by Michel Cochard during his protectorate in Morocco between 1946 and 1952, the habitat for Le Plus Grand Number was officially presented at the 9th CM meeting in Aix-en-Provence. It was here that Cochard, Georges Candilis, and Shadow Woods presented their housing projects on the outskirts of Casablanca. For Cochard, Le Plus Grand Number signified the many people who moved from rural areas to the city and required housing. Against the backdrop of colonialism, the French architect understood Le Plus Grand Number as people needing to conform to modern life. At the CM meeting, Le Plus Grand Number and its habitat translated into a program for educating people on modernity through modern buildings. However, when De Carlo proposed the greater number at the study center meeting of 1966, the goal was no longer that of promoting modern architecture outside European context. By the late 1960s, geographical relationships and world mapping were in a process of radical transformation. Not only was colonialism finally coming to an end, but a sense of confinement of Earth's limited resources was on the rise. Buckminster Fuller delivered his spaceship Earth lecture in 1964, while the world's first photograph of Earth from space was shot in August of 1966. In this context, the question for De Carlo and his fellow Team 10 members lay in the limits of Earth's resources in relationship to the planet's growing human population. This became clear in a mail exchange on the exhibition between Woods and De Carlo, in which Woods wrote, Dear Giancarlo, in the months and half, in the 2 months and a half in which the Triennale will last, the world urban population will grow by approximately 9 million. That is the population of Milan every 15 days. Is it interesting to show this data in the introduction to the exhibition? The preparation for the Triennale, in the preparation for the Triennale, Woods collected photographs describing the unprecedented growth of the world's population and the effects of this on the urban environment. The photographs depicted American suburbs, the Indian shantytown, modern construction, and so forth. These images recalled De Carlo's short film, The City of Men, presented at the 10th Milan Triennale in 1954. Both Wood's photographs and De Carlo's film showed a world crowded with people and buildings. The striking difference between them, however, was the context. While Wood's images told the story of a globalized world, De Carlo's film still focused on the local dimension of European cities, a dimension that was revised in the 14th Triennale. After the meeting of March 1966, De Carlo further clarified his understanding of the greater number. The greater number, he wrote, we mean the contemporary system of human needs that has assumed proportions never before experienced in history due to the dissemination of democracy, greater well-being, the increase in social mobility, the growth of production, end quote. Accordingly, the greater number referred to the world's ever-growing population with access to mass production and the daily life of which was affected by a consumer-based economy. In other words, the greater number was a global phenomenon. However, the greater number was not simply a label for describing an existing phenomenon. That is the number of people affected by mass production. It was also a way of formulating a new political role for this multitude. Even if mass production had, in fact, witnessed the birth of a greater number of people, De Carlo carefully distinguished the greater number of individuals from mass society as a whole. While the society of the masses was a given datum, the participation of the greater number of individuals in the organization of public affairs was a point to be conquered. The final explanation of the greater number, the one included in the exhibition catalogue, acquired a broader, yet more generic meaning. By this point, the greater number had become a methodological process capable of quantifying large-scale phenomena, a process aimed at collecting, classifying, analyzing, and interpreting phenomena as numerical data. Thus, from conception to realization, the greater number came to acquire different meanings: the massive quantity of objects produced by a consumer-based economy and its inclusion in the human environment, the immensity of individuals affected but also empowered by the new means of production, a tool for processing and controlling large quantity of problems. During the various iterations of the greater number, however, the question of how architecture could contribute to the environment affected by system of production and extraction persisted. 6 years after the meeting at the Palazzo dell'Arte, the Club of Rome, headed by Italian industrialist Aurelio Peccei, published the famous The Limits to Growth in 1972. The report, authored by a team of analysts at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston. By then, the concerns towards a growing population and the resources needed for its for caring of them had reached a global awareness. The discussion at the Palazzo dell'Arte for the preparation of the 14th Milan Triennale presents an early understanding of the ecological problem by Italian architects, one that not simply described the effects of the overpopulation of people and objects on the environment. It offered a model by which to reimagine architecture as a field of knowledge in its relationship to ecology. This was based on questioning both what meant to build, to inhabit, and to inhabit our planet. As per its etymology, ecology was understood as a study of the oikos, of the household. The origin of the term asserted the question of habitation through autonomy. Earth, as our household, is inhabited. Conflating the fundamentally architectural issue of domesticity with the one of environmentalism, the discussion at the Palazzo dell'Arte on the habitation of Earth was about adaptation, consumption, extraction, and destruction. It was also of care. The architecture of the greater number was, in fact, not only denouncing the impoverishment of the planet's resources, but it was also a call of action for its inhabitants to care for their environment. Aftermath. The story goes that the A Greater Number exhibition was occupied by a group of students in the day of its opening. The installation was severely damaged over the 2 months of occupation, and then the police erupted in the Palazzo dell'Arte. The exhibition had to be closed and restored before to be open again to the public a few months later. But the students' eruption also contributed to the escalation of the emerging neo-rational tendenza as represented in the Milanese context by Aldo Rossi, Massimo Scolari, and Giorgio Grassi. In fact, while Rossi resigned in 1966 from the study center after the March meeting due to disagreement with De Carlo, he went on to create the Architectural City section in the following 1973 Triennale, advocating for an autonomous language of architecture. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Federica. I think for this time we will, because you're staying with us, right, for the discussion at the end, we will keep the question unless there is some urgent question, but I think it would be interesting later on to also discuss how, my camera is off, how the Milan Triennale also then played a role in conjunction with, I mean, you mentioned the Venice Biennale of 1980 and what happens also to the Milan Triennale later in the 80s, and how I think it's quite interesting that Giancarlo De Carlo obviously didn't have a postmodern exhibition in the, let's say, stylistic way of the term, but definitely had some very postmodern or themes of postmodernity in his discourse. And you mentioned also environment and care and things that, you know, are also important thematic up to today. So anyway, I think it will be interesting to also discuss how the Triennale evolves in the year after the 80s. And so any urgent question? No, we can go for, we will go for a quick break of 15 minutes. We will come back at 3:15 also for the live streaming. We will shut down and come back in 15 minutes if you need a coffee or anything. Yeah, thank you. Okay, welcome back. I'll wait another minute, Sergio, and then we will start. Okay, so our third speaker today is Sergio M. Figueiredo. So Sergio is not very far from us, he's in Eindhoven. And Sergio is also an architect, an author, curator, and historian. A little bit like Kim and Federica, we all worked on related topic at the same time. Sergio did his PhD in UCLA on the Netherlands Architecture Institute, and he since then published it as a great book published in 2016, The Nye Effect, Creating Architecture Culture. Sergio is now assistant professor of architecture history and theory at TU Eindhoven, where he also founded this great initiative called Curatorial Research Collective, CRC, and is also the chief curator of Casa Vertigo, which, if I understand well, is the gallery of the University of Eindhoven. So there's also a program of exhibition going on that he curates. His work focuses on architectural institutions and exhibitions, so a perfect speaker for our seminar today, particularly how they shape or are shaped by architecture culture, which he continues to develop through numerous contributions to publication conferences, including editorship of an issue of Oase magazine. I don't remember the exact number, but on the museum. Which number? You're on mute.
99. Oase 99.
Yeah, 99. So Sergio, we're looking forward to hear more about. We actually did not talk about the Netherlands Architecture Institute yet, although we are in the Netherlands. So we're very much looking forward to hear.
Okay, then it will all be new for you. But in an interesting twist of fate, because you're sitting at the Berlage is actually also part of this big institutional push to support Dutch architecture in the late 80s, early 90s. The Berlage, as it was established in Amsterdam in the orphanage building from Alvin Boyarski. Anyway, we'll talk about the NIE today. Let me just share my screen and we'll get started. Ooh. Okay. Barely have to allow it. Oh, I actually have to quit Zoom and come back in order to share my screen.
Okay, and then
so I'm just going to leave and come back. Okay.
He will be back, I hope.
Okay, hi, I'm back.
Hi.
Let me try it again. Hopefully now it will work.
It worked for the others.
Yeah, it's just a new laptop and you need to give permissions for everything. Okay, so can you see it? Right. Okay, so hello all. Thank you, Lea Catherine, for your kind invitation and the opportunity to discuss with you a topic that greatly interests me. And as the title already indicates, today I will be talking about the Netherlands Architecture Institute, or NAI in the Dutch version. Specifically, I would like to discuss the series of events and developments that led to the establishment of the Institute in 1988, which was really the conclusion of a dream that was developed in the Netherlands since at least the mid-1800s, and an indelible mark in the recent history of Dutch architecture culture. Perhaps a good way to start this story is, paradoxically enough, from the end. So in the late 1990s and early 2000s, Dutch architecture was seemingly everywhere. So in every bookshop, in every studio, in every project review. Everywhere, it seems, there were whispers of how the Dutch were approaching architecture, and that seemed to be a benchmark to which all other work was measured against. 1995 has been recognized by many as a particularly notable year in that regard, as Rem Koolhaas published with Bruce Mau SMLXL, this 1,300-page behemoth compilation of projects and observations, which would quickly become a de facto Bible of architecture studios everywhere, thus fostering Rem Koolhaas' international stardom to achieve supernova status, as well as becoming a seminal precedent for emerging Dutch talent, who began to publish their own compendium of manifestos and projects, let's say, presenting not so much monographs on their work, but rather a continuation of their work by this other means. Few, however, are aware of how the NAI was actually a crucial element in that book ever seeing the light of day, specifically as the NAI provided much needed financial assistance to Rem Koolhaas' troubled Office for Metropolitan Architecture at the end of 1994. This was quite a remarkable operation, and since the Institute had not been mandated to provide financial assistance to architecture offices, the operation was presented as a purchase of OMA's archival material, mostly design and final models of 6 projects, that were to be included in the Institute's own collection. This, however, is worth noticing, was known internally as a kind of a hidden state subsidy to the troubled office, which contradicted every single collection policy that the NAI had in place and was, as Hein van Haren, then director of the NAI, mentioned, well beyond the Institute's financial capability. By 2000, when Bart Lootsma published his famous, or infamous, depending on who you talk with, anyway, when he published his famous book, Super Dutch, New Architecture in the Netherlands, and the international admiration for Dutch architecture was, let's say, at its peak, few would have doubted of the NAI's decision if they had been aware of it in the first place. And this is but an example of how interventive the NAI could be, albeit exceptionally in this instance, in pursuing its stated goal of developing a favorable climate for Dutch architecture, which means mostly in the background, but with significant influence. So the nebulous intention of supporting, let's say, the re-emergence of Dutch architecture was what so many had imagined throughout the 1980s, as they, in the very typical Dutch polder model approach, negotiated a new architecture institute. Specifically, beyond stimulating a greater appreciation of architecture and assisting in the preservation of architectural knowledge, the proposed institute was intended to offer an indispensable contribution to the development of an awareness for architectural quality among the general public. So the observed lack of quality in Dutch architecture in urban centers could be traced back to the post-war period, when in response to the housing shortage caused by the Second World War, the Dutch government had funded and developed large-scale projects of settlement. The focus of the government had been in quantity rather than quality, and it was now time to address that imbalance. Furthermore, following the impetus towards rationalization in the 1950s and 60s, the 1970s were marked by a further removal of architects from the process of construction. Under the guise of building community consensus, residence committees, local politicians, and a myriad of consultants increasingly displaced architects in the design process. as several proto-humanist structures of fragmented geometries were built around these introspective cul-de-sacs, an architecture of dubious quality, or so believed to be of dubious quality in the 1980s, came to dominate Dutch cityscapes. However, the development of an institutional framework to stimulate architectural quality in the Netherlands was not only motivated by the recent past, but also by the near future of Dutch architecture. As Dutch society was transitioning from a welfare state to a neoliberal economy in the early 1980s, policies of privatization and deregulation were looming over architecture and spatial planning, which exacerbated the urgency to promote architectural quality. Specifically, with the privatization of public housing and the shift towards renting office spaces for administrative and other public functions, two exceptionally powerful policy instruments, the one quantitative and the other qualitative, to promote architectural quality, had been lost by the government. Without these instruments, the government attempted to ensure that a high-quality architectural climate was established by supporting institutions such as the Future Architecture Institute, effectively shifting its policy from a position of action and prescription to one of persuasion and influence. The urgency to improve Dutch architectural quality was also increasingly noticeable as a greater awareness of quality was demanded by developments in publications and public opinion. Most notably, in 1977, in an attempt to constitute a list of top 10 buildings in Rotterdam and launch the basis for an architectural guide to the city, the architecture section of the Rotterdam's Arts Council introduced the Keurmeesters project, so the inspection project. And for this inspection project, 3 foreign architectural critics were invited to review 22 post-war buildings in Rotterdam, which could also provide an assessment of the state of architecture in that city. And with some notable exceptions, the critics were appalled. While diverging in the specifics of their assessment, Kenneth Frampton, Stanislaw von Moos, and Francesco Dalcò agreed in their negative assessment, arguing that the legacy of early modern works such as the Van Eyck Fabriek and the Kiefhoek had been all but lost in the architectural practices that dominated the Netherlands in the post-war period. With this high-profile episode, the dismal state of Dutch architecture was embarrassingly and very publicly exposed. Suddenly, it was evident that previous approaches to architecture were completely depleted and a radical shift was necessary to recover Dutch architecture's previous standing. The proposed institute was just the first step in the government's renewed support for architecture, institutionalizing its new approach to architecture as not just an economic, but also a cultural and social activity. So beyond revealing the troubles afflicting Dutch architecture, the visit of the 3 foreign critics to Rotterdam also indicated a possible course of action to address those issues. After a long period of self-imposed isolation, Dutch architecture was now intent on experiencing a renewed openness to international influences. In 1982, the same section that had organized the 77 Keurmeester project rehearsed the first response to the concerns raised by it by organizing an event with the specific purpose of enhancing the cultural dimension of buildings in the Netherlands, the Air Festival, the Koop van Zout. And while the architectural festival was comprised of a wide range of activities, from symposia and debates to publications and exhibitions, its central element was the invitation of renowned foreign architects to formulate proposals for the vacant docklands on the south bank of the Maas River known as the Koop van Zout, where today you will find, for example, OMA's De Rotterdam. In any case, the invitation of Aldo Rossi, O.M. Ungers, J.B. Clayhouse, Derek Walker, and Richard Meyer marked a turning point in Dutch architecture by challenging the existing condition in which the process counted for more than the resulting urban image. Moreover, by stimulating the connection between Dutch and international architecture, the festival marked the start of a period in which imported luminaries reinvigorated Dutch architectural culture and was thus true to its name of Architecture International Rotterdam. Beyond successfully engaging the general public with architecture and drawing large crowds to its activities, the first air is mostly remembered for using foreign architects to confront the vacuum in which Dutch architecture and urban planning had existed until then. To overcome this vacuum in Dutch architecture, local politicians adopted a similar response and invited leading foreign architects to design municipal buildings across the Netherlands. This response was particularly embraced by aldermen affiliated with the PvdA, the Partij van de Arbeid, the Dutch Labour Party. And this was from Maastricht in the south to Groningen in the north. And by awarding commissions to foreign architects, local city councils attempted to affect the quality and the existing dynamics of the architecture being built in their cities. So beyond improving the architectural and urban quality of their cities, these commissions established a dialogue between local and foreign architects, thus challenging Dutch architects to adopt the same high standards in their designs. By the end of the 1980s, the number of foreign architects working in the Netherlands amounted to what some have described to a full-on invasion. No one embodied this response better than Adrie Douwestein, the alderman for urban renewal and urban planning in The Hague. Very explicitly, Douwestein intended to elevate urban renewal projects and the construction of new municipal buildings to the level of cultural activities, even if that meant a certain incongruity of commissions. So after having commissioned the Portuguese architect Álvaro Siza to design social housing in the Schilderswijk neighborhood, Douwestein approached Spanish architect Ricardo Bofill for another housing project, and at the same time he also invited the Italian Aldo Rossi to devise a master plan for the site of the former municipal abattoir, and Berlin-based Robert Krier to develop the master plan for the resident area. Douwestein's crowning accomplishment, however, was the organization of a limited international competition for the new building of The Hague City Hall, which would eventually be awarded to American Richard Meyer, which worked as a magnet for the redevelopment of the entire Spouw area. Tellingly, Adrie Douwestein would be appointed as the first director of the NAI. So despite some initial, let's say, local resistance, the intense dialogue between foreign and Dutch architects, stimulated by the influx of foreign architectural expertise, was beneficial for Dutch architecture. Even though not all projects designed by foreign architects were either completed or successful, with a growing exchange between Dutch and foreign architectural circles, far beyond the limited, let's say, institutionalization afforded by Dutch offices acting as local supervising architects for internationally renowned designers, the level of architectural discourse and practice in the Netherlands was certainly reinvigorated. And this was the start of a broader recognition in Dutch architecture of the crucial importance of developing dialogue and developing discourse as a way to sustain a strong architectural culture. Therefore, the notion of dialogue would become particularly important for the establishment of a new architectural institution in the Netherlands, being embedded at the root of the institution from the very beginning, as the NAI would be founded by the merger of two, actually you can also consider it three, but today I'm only going to talk about two, of two very different institutions. By then, the idea and ambition to establish an architecture museum in the Netherlands was already quite old. At least since 1842, with the foundation of the Maatschappij tot Bevordering der Bouwkunst, that is, the Society for the Promotion of Architecture, that had operated as an architecture museum avant la lettre in Amsterdam. Much like the NAI would do 150 years later, the Maatschappij had attempted to promote architecture to elevate its quality and cultivate the taste of patrons and the general public to a productive appreciation of the discipline's cultural and social dimensions. In any case, in the mid-1970s, there were two institutions operating in Amsterdam geared towards the same ambitions, or at least in their combination, fulfilling the same role. The Netherlands Documentatiecentrum voor de Bouwkunst, so the Dutch Documentation Center for Architecture, or NDB as it was known, had been established in 1970 by the Dutch government as a way to safeguard Dutch architectural heritage. Operating under the Department of Monuments, the Rijksdienst voor de Monumentenzorg, as its name already indicated, it had a clear mandate to operate as a documentation and archive center which could facilitate research for others. It began its operations by attempting to concentrate in one building, an old warehouse in Amsterdam, the relevant material already in the government stewardship across its various departments and organizations, including the Rijksprenten Cabinet, which at the time was associated with the Rijksmuseum, which still held a wealth of architectural drawings, objects, and archives that had been donated to the government throughout the years with the express purpose of creating an architecture museum. Routinely, plastic bags full of architectural drawings were hauled across Amsterdam in a transport bicycle from the Rijksprenten Cabinet to the warehouse in the Arsenal. Since the documentation center was remarkably understaffed, the NDB established partnerships with several academic institutions across the Netherlands, welcoming several art and architecture history students as interns. Their contribution was fundamental as they carried out the menial yet crucial work of cataloging the archives. In return, they had unfettered and often unregulated access to the collections, therefore having the opportunity to be the first to produce authoritative work on the most influential architects in the Netherlands. Beyond supplying the documentation center with, let's say, inexpensive staff, the connection to academic institutions also ensured that many researchers found their way to the NDB. As an increasingly formidable repository of Dutch architecture history, the main outlet for the NDB's work quickly became academic research. The foundation of the NDB had been an important step in the long march towards the establishment of an architecture museum in the Netherlands, but one that still fell short of what an architecture museum could and should be, that is, a fundamental instrument in advancing architecture. Such an architecture museum was to combine archives and collections with a strong presentation and engagement, to use its reflections on architecture history to engage with architecture's contemporary reality. It would add to the documentation center a proper outlet to stimulate the exchange of architectural knowledge as well as the production of new knowledge, ensuring that the archive would not remain a self-contained entity without any significant influence over architecture's actual development. More than a museum, what was necessary was an architecture institute. In the process of forming the Netherlands Architecture Institute, the establishment, organization, and support of an inclusive architectural debate became the most crucial proposition. After all, the NDB already possessed, let's say, a towering architectural archive, but it had failed to frequently engage it in a meaningful way with a broader audience. As it became prevalent that the continuous confrontation between history and architecture could activate the NDB's archive and foster a greater societal engagement, the institutionalization of a dialectical opposition became a crucial intention for the foundation of such a progressive architectural institute. In pursuing this objective and developing the documentation center into, let's say, a fully fledged architecture institute, the NDB found in the activist organization Stichting Wonen, or Living or Housing Foundation, a deserving partner for a productive dialectical confrontation. After having introduced the Dutch public to modern living since 1946 as sort of basically a showroom for modern furniture, in 1973, the Stichting Wonen found a new purpose when their magazine Wonen merged with the architectural magazine TABK, the Tijdschrift voor Architectuur en Beeldende Kunst, or the magazine for architecture and visual arts. This arrangement dramatically altered the foundation's profile, which now found an important outlet and a substantial audience in the newly established biweekly magazine Wonen TABK, particularly as the magazine became a central element in the effort to resist the controversial modern urban renewal of Amsterdam in the first half of the 1970s, and with it, so did Stichting Wonen. But in order to effect real change, both foundation and magazine had to engage with a much wider constituency. Therefore, Wonen TABK decisively changed from what used to be a very professional-oriented platform into a broadly oriented cultural periodical, seeking structural collaborations with disciplines beyond architecture and urban planning. By 1979, once the battles about urban renewal had subsided, the foundation's stated objective was, and now I quote, the awakening of an understanding of the cultural aspects of the design of the built environment, end of quote, to the widest possible audience. So it seemed like the Stichting Wonen was the perfect partner for the NDB. The favorable conditions and wide agreement for the establishment of an architecture institute culminated in the joint organization by the Stichting Wonen and the NDB of the 1983 Biennale of Young Dutch Architects, the first iteration of this particular Biennale. This event not only served as a testing ground for their cooperation, but also as a preview of the future institute's approach to architecture and commitment to inclusive discussion and public engagement. As the 1983 Biennale intended to have an active role in the debate about architectural quality and the position of the design disciplines within culture and society, much like the proposed institute, this first Biennale intended to establish a platform for public discussion, the presentation of architectural ideas, both old and new, and the support of an emerging architectural talent. Furthermore, the Biennale presented exhibitions and discussions as favored mediums for the dissemination of architecture, as well as its engagement with the wider public. The parallel between the Biennale and the Institute was merely confirmed by the suggestion that the institutions responsible for its organization were the perfect components for the future Architectural Institute, with their complementary functions and objectives. At the Biennale, much like in the first pleas to establish an architectural institution, the organization of a continued dialectical confrontation between architectural and historical practice was a favored and particularly compelling argument for establishing the NAI. The focus of the discussion in this central component was not due to any, let's say, dismissal of either an unbiased architectural archive or societal engagement, but simply resulted from an understanding that these were already present in Dutch architectural culture in the form of these two institutions, the NDB and the Stichting Wonen. The organization of a sustained discussion was the connecting element that could further potentiate the other two elements and was no longer to be neglected. Therefore, it became widely understood and supported that while these functions were already being performed separately by these two institutions, a closer coordination of their activities would create in the future Architecture Institute a much more assertive instrument for the advancement of architecture than the two organizations could ever achieve independently. After lengthy preparations, the two organizations were to be merged into a new architectural institute, with their merger effectively establishing this dialectical opposition between Dutch architecture's past in the form of the NDB and its future in the form of Stichting Wonen, which would in fact come to define the intellectual basis for the NAI. This merger not only resonated with, but institutionalized a renewed conception of history within architecture in the Netherlands. With a comprehensive architecture archive that encouraged a constant reassessment of history, the NAI established a platform for discussion and revealed new paths for architectural practice. But most importantly, it institutionalized a productive dialectic confrontation between history and design, between architecture's past and future, which again became the primary element for the NAI's effort in developing architectural discourse. Ultimately, at least when it was established, the NAI was intended to become a common platform for discussion, where different positions could be engaged. Specifically, the NAI was to initiate and lend form to the debate by providing a forum, by inviting the interested parties and challenging them to speak to each other, by formulating material for the debate, by remaining alert to misunderstandings and differences in language which could disrupt communication. Furthermore, the combination of different functions, specifically the archive, the library, the study center, the museum, the publisher, the stimulator, the forum for debate, and the producer of an architectural magazine, opened up what was considered to be untold possibilities for an integrated forum for architecture in which critical discussion could be bolstered by different means of engagement. Effectively, the NAI was to become the facilitator of an architectural debate and discourse in the Netherlands, planting the seeds from which the Super Dutch would germinate in the second half of the 1990s. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergio, for this very compelling history of the scene in the Netherlands, which I think the students were very interested to hear about. So we will immediately go to the last talk of this institutional voices of the recent past with Patrick Zamarian, who's going to talk about the AA in the 1970s. And after that, immediately after, we'll open a debate between, or a discussion, let's say, and questions between the three speakers that remained and the students and myself. So Patrick, are you able to share your screen?
I can certainly try. Yes, it's looking good.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, hi, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to.
Sorry, Patrick, I forgot to introduce you properly. So I need to.
Okay.
Sorry, before you start. So Patrick Zamarian is also a qualified architect and an architectural historian. He teaches at the moment at the Liverpool School of Architecture, but he holds a master's degree in architecture, history and theory from the ETH Zurich and a doctorate in architectural history from the University of Liverpool. As a lecturer in Liverpool, he also co-leads the Architectural and Urban History Research Group. And Patrick's research centers on the role of educational and professional institutions in the history of architecture. So again, a perfect specialist for our symposium today, specifically focusing on the UK, on the United Kingdom. And he is the author, as I mentioned a bit earlier, of a very recent 2020 Lund Humphreys book, Architectural Association in the Post-War Years. So Patrick, sorry to have interrupted you. And
not at all.
You can go.
Well, thanks very much. And again, hi, everyone. And thank you for inviting me to talk about the Architectural Association. I will be focusing my talk on the postmodern period, and particularly the 1970s. But before I come to that, allow me to dig briefly into the history of the AA, which we will need as a backdrop for our discussion today. The AA is somewhat unusual among the institutions that we are discussing today and that you are discussing in your pro seminar more generally, because unlike most of these, the AA was not a new foundation, far from it. The AA was established in 1847 by architectural apprentices who were unhappy with the training they received from their masters and decided to form a professional association to set up and run its own school of architecture. Nothing of this kind existed at the time, and so architectural education in the United Kingdom basically started with the AA. Now, the fact that the AA was founded by students and has always given them a say in its affairs explains its nonconformist fervor, which it has preserved until the present day. The AA remains the only independent school of architecture in the United Kingdom. It is also the only school of architecture run by a professional body of architects, not just in the UK, but so far as I'm aware, anywhere in the world. It is important to remember this when we talk about the developments in the 1970s and 1980s later on. Now, after the Second World War, the AA emerged as the unrivaled school of architecture in the United Kingdom and one of the leading schools of architecture in the world. And this slide here shows, merely as an illustration, the thesis project of Denise Scott Brown, one of its more notable alumni. The AA maintained this status, this prominence, until the early 1960s, when it fell into an existential crisis, only to re-emerge in the early 1970s as a completely renewed and reinvigorated institution that set out to explore and redefine the disciplinary parameters of architecture in a world after modernism. My aim today is to explain how this transformation came about, what it entailed, and what its implications were both within and beyond the confines of the AA. Now, before I get into that, allow me to briefly highlight some of the major sources for my talk today and for the AA's postmodern history more generally. They include Andrew Higgitt's Mediating Modernism of 2007, as well as the doctoral research of Irene Sanwu at Princeton and of Igor Marjanovic at University College London, both of which have produced a series of excellent journal outputs, a couple of which you can see at the center here on this slide. The emphasis of all three scholars, so Higgitt, Sanwu and Marjanovic, is on Alvin Boyarski, who directed the AA from 1971 until his death in 1990. My own research complements their work by focusing on the broader institutional context within which he and his predecessors operated. But having said this, it is quite difficult to draw a clear line between the two because Boyarski came to embody the AA like nobody before or since, as should become clear in the course of my talk. To explain the transformation that occurred at the AA in the early 1970s, we will need to touch briefly on the events leading up to it. In 1958, the RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects, had organized the so-called Oxford Conference, a landmark event in the history of architectural education in the UK, at which it was decided that in future, all architecture schools should be affiliated to universities and enforce considerably higher academic standards than before. From the early 1960s, the AA came under growing pressure to toe the line and link itself into this new higher education system. And so the AA Council pursued a merger with Imperial College, a subsidiary of the University of London. This was completely unacceptable to most students and staff who were determined to preserve the AA's autonomy, and the merger plan eventually crumbled under their pressure. The government, meanwhile, was no longer prepared to give financial support to an independent school of architecture. And in December 1970, the situation was such that the AA faced imminent collapse and permanent closure. This triggered feverish collective action among students and staff who implemented a series of cost-saving measures and worked out a new model of governance aimed to curtail the powers of the current council, which was seen as duplicitous and incapable of safeguarding the AA's independence. The slide shows on the left a project submitted to the competition for a new AA headquarters on the Imperial College campus, which indicates just how far this merger scheme had progressed by the time it was cancelled. And on the right, you can see one of many school meetings that took place in the early 1970s to explore a way forward for the AA. Now, with its back to the wall, the AA was susceptible to a radical solution, and this radical solution presented itself in the person of Alvin Boyarski. Boyarski was a Canadian architect who had studied at McGill and then at Cornell under Colin Rowe. In the early 1960s, Boyarski had practiced and taught in London, first at the Bartlett and then at the AA. And here at the AA, he clashed repeatedly with the then principal, William Allen, who eventually sacked him. Now, Allen was one of the masterminds behind the RIBA's Oxford conference. And so Boyarski's hostility to his superior did wonders for his anti-establishment credentials at the AA. So that was one part of his appeal. The other was the drive and organizational skill he showed as the founder director of the International Institute of Design, the IID, which was making a huge impact on the London scene at the time. Between 1970 and 1972, Boyarski arranged an annual series of 6-week IID summer sessions at the vacated premises of London schools, including the AA, each of them offering a dense but loosely organized program of workshops, seminars, field studies, and design projects, which attracted students from across the globe and for which Boyarski managed to gather a star-studded international faculty without any independent funding whatsoever. So Boyarski seemed the right person to pull the AA from the edge of the abyss, even though his proposition to transform the AA into a permanent IID summer session was, of course, inherently contradictory. The International Institute of Design drew much of its appeal from the fact that it was ephemeral, facilitating brief and highly focused interactions between people passing through its sessions for a few weeks every year. It had no permanent faculty, it had no facilities, and it had no money. The AA also had no money, but it did have staff and studio spaces and all the other paraphernalia of a traditional school of architecture. In its place, Boyarski hoped to create an ambience which was, to quote Higgett, broadly inclusive and characterized by a diversity of polemics, and to locate this activity within a wide cultural discourse, unquote. I will show in a moment how Boyarski solved this conundrum, but I would first like to touch on another contradiction in his program, namely the desired global outlook of the AA, which was, of course, like any other school of architecture, rooted in a very specific local and national context. The internationalization of Boyarski's AA had two aspects, one concerning the nature and impact of its activities, and the other, the makeup of its student body. In AA folklore, these two issues have been conflated into a coherent narrative, as though they were both part of the same overarching vision. This, however, was not the case. Boyarski clearly saw the problem of architectural education through an international, or at least transatlantic lens, and he was eager to position the AA as a major node in a global discursive network, as he had done with the International Institute of Design. Boyarski also welcomed the presence of a polyglot student body. In the 1970s, the proportion of international students at the AA doubled from 25% to 50%, and it now stands at somewhere around 90%. However, the idea that Boyarski sought to attract these international students for anything other than financial reasons is something of an AA myth. The AA was completely dependent on student fees, and due to rising inflation in the early 1970s, these fees soon became prohibitive for all but the wealthiest of UK students. For more than a decade, Boyarski tried to build pressure on the government to reinstate its grants to the AA, but in the meantime, he had to fill the places in the school somehow, and so he turned to an international market. This slide here shows the driver of Boyarski's global recruitment campaign, which was a travel exhibition curated by Peter Cook, which toured the globe for half a decade, often accompanied by a member of Boyarski's teaching staff, or indeed by Boyarski himself. The exhibition poster highlights what would be the two major pillars of Boyarski's vision for the AA. One was its sheer creative force and eclecticism, which Boyarski supercharged through a new educational system. And the other was its readiness and ability to transcend its physical and intellectual boundaries and bring itself into a broader discourse. So let's take a closer look at these two pillars. One of them was Boyarski's new teaching model, the so-called unit system. Instead of tying them into a fixed and universal curriculum, students at the AA were expected to shape their own courses of study by choosing between different units with different approaches and different methodologies. Both the basic idea of a permissive learning environment and the eclecticism it produced reflected a certain lack of conviction and, of course, chimed with architectural and societal anxieties in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Yet neither was, in fact, a novelty for the AA. The unit system built on a similar system established by Boyarski's immediate predecessor, John Lloyd, which itself had partly revived an earlier unit system that was used at the AA in the 1930s. Eclecticism, too, had been a distinctive feature of AA student work long before Boyarski arrived. Indeed, one of the main features distinguishing the AA from other leading modernist schools in the post-war period, notably Gropius's Harvard GSD, was precisely the fact that it actively encouraged experimentation and very deliberately refrained from fostering anything that came even close to an AA house style. So in this sense, Boyarski's innovation fell on fruitful soil. What was new about Boyarski's reiteration of the unit system was its competitive nature. Unit leaders were compelled to define a distinct theoretical position and sell it very aggressively to students, not least because their job effectively depended on it. So each unit had its own budget, and if it couldn't attract enough students, it was pretty much doomed. So by pitting the various units against each other, Boyarski created a volatile atmosphere of controversy, of heated polemic, which was further enhanced by the AA's long-established tradition of open crits, an example of which you can see pictured on the right with Boyarski sitting here at the center and to his right, Peter Cook. The sheer volume and range of student work far exceeds the scope of a short seminar talk, or indeed an entire series of seminar talks. So these are just two fairly random examples from the mid-1970s, which we might call the idealistic period of the unit system. The image on the left shows work produced in a diploma unit led by Bernard Tschumi, which engaged with avant-garde art practices and cinematic narratives to explore and analyze and intervene in urban space. Nigel Coates, who produced this panel, later succeeded Tschumi and saw his entire unit failed by James Sterling and Ed Jones, the external examiners, who simply couldn't recognize any of its work as architecture. The other image shows an example of the rational technology unit under Gerald Foley, which illustrates the genuine diversity that existed in the early period of the unit system. Eventually, the free market logic underpinning this system, which was premised on sales skill and consumer choice, took its toll. And by the early 1980s, units that pursued a social, political, or ecological agenda had all been crowded out by flashier, visually more seductive, and therefore more marketable offerings. Remarkably, the unit system extended to the various lecture courses, which were reframed as so-called service units and operated on the same pick and choose basis as the design units. So in other words, there was no body of knowledge that was deemed to be indispensable for prospective architects, no methodology that was seen as fundamentally right, and equally none that was seen as fundamentally wrong. There was a technical studies unit which covered the technological aspects of the course. We will ignore this today in the spirit of Boyarski himself, who had absolutely no interest in it and repeatedly risked the AA's accreditation through this neglect. What was formerly a conventional art and history department was divided into a general studies unit and a communications unit, which between them coordinated the second strand of Boyarski's policy for the AA, which was an incredibly wide spectrum of events, exhibitions, and publications to support the pedagogical program of the school, but also to disseminate its creative outputs more widely. Now, we can only scratch the surface here, but a few items are worth pointing out. The slide shows the control room of the communications unit, which was directed by Archigram member Dennis Crompton and took charge of the arts teaching with a very strong emphasis on audiovisual techniques and media production. Perhaps the most fascinating and certainly the most quirky feature of this was the TVAA, a closed circuit television network which penetrated every aspect of the AA's operations, broadcasting a mixture of student videos, live lectures, and recorded events via numerous monitors that were distributed throughout the premises. The General Studies Unit, meanwhile, was directed by Robin Middleton, formerly the technical editor of architectural design, who used his network of contacts to set up an astonishingly wide-ranging program of events. This randomly selected events list gives an idea of the sheer number of occasions that took place at the AA every single week. Incidentally, there was no clear distinction between seminars, lecture courses, and public talks. Most events were freely accessible and students could attend as many as they wanted or none at all. The entire purpose of the events program and of the AA as a whole was not to instruct students, but to give them the means and ingredients to construct their own professional identities and to offer them a forum to debate their positions. With student numbers continuously rising, the AA soon ran out of studio space. And so the interactions among students and staff played out across the premises, in lecture halls, in corridors, and perhaps most notably in the first floor bar, which of course is still the case today. The various steps that were taken to energized the debate within the school were complemented by equally ambitious measures to disperse its creative outputs, specifically through a comprehensive program of exhibitions and publications, almost all of them commissioned, curated, and edited by Boyarski himself. Boyarski gave upcoming young tutors such as Zaha Hadid or Daniel Liebeskind a platform to show and advertise their work. But the most important annual event was and remains the annual exhibition of student work. And this slide here shows Zaha Hadid supervising the students of her particular unit as they prepare their display for the annual exhibition. Equally important was the project review, which was published in conjunction with this annual exhibition. The project review itemized and cataloged the work of the various units and fed them as the AA's collective contribution into a wider architectural discourse, and did this very successfully. We have copies of these in our library at Liverpool, and I'm sure many other architectural schools do as well. The project review was launched in 1975, but Boyarski's publishing program really took off in the early 1980s when he created an entire ecosystem of book titles classified into distinct series, themes, folios, megas, works, types, texts, each covering a specific subject or body of drawings, and almost all of them promoting the work produced from within the AA. Again, besides the television station, none of this was entirely new. The AA had always had its own publications, and it had always had a public events program. What was new under Boyarski was the tremendous scope of it, but especially the fact that it was intrinsically linked to the teaching program. And this, by means of a conclusion, brings us back to the institutional framework within which all these developments played out, and thus to the core theme of your pro seminar. The AA, it must be said, did not accommodate Boyarski's vision very smoothly. On the contrary, the AA, lest we forget, was two things in one. It was a school of architecture, and it was a professional association of architects. Boyarski's sole concern was for the school. He had no interest whatsoever in the association, which represented the wider membership and was generally dismissed as the establishment. Inevitably, the institutional history of the AA in the 1970s was that of a power struggle between Boyarski and the association. Boyarski won this struggle by diverting responsibilities and the respective funding from the association to the school. So, in other words, he defunded and disempowered the association to cut favors with the school, the only constituency that mattered to him. Events and publication programs, which had previously fallen within the association's remit, now became a function of the school, reimagined and readjusted to inform the pedagogical discourse within and beyond the school. This picture here of Boyarski riding an elephant across Bedford Square, you can see the AA building in the background. This was merely a carnival stunt, but it does offer a fairly appropriate metaphor for his time as chairman of the AA, which he conquered and remodeled in the ruthless manner of a colonizer. Boyarski subverted and distorted the institutional framework of the AA, but he did not break it. He didn't have to. As it turned out, the AA's peculiar system of internal democracy made it vulnerable to autocratic tendencies, and temporarily at least, its electorate was willing to sacrifice one of its core principles for the other, its proper democratic process, for the promise of a lofty independence, which I suppose makes the AA a characteristically English institution after all, in spite of its international makeup. Having said all this, what Boyarski achieved at the AA was truly remarkable. Had it not been for him, the AA would probably not exist today, and certainly not as an independent school of architecture. Instead, in the 1970s, the AA emerged and subsequently consolidated itself as an entirely unique institution in the field of architectural education, one which committed itself to critical inquiry and the creation of theory, rather than training students for professional practice, as had previously been its mission. From a 21st century perspective, there's nothing unusual about the presence of competing units in schools of architecture, about research studios where new theoretical positions are explored, about final theses where an actual building is only one of many possible design outputs. These things are so commonplace nowadays that it is perhaps difficult to imagine just how extraordinary they were when they first appeared, opening up an entirely new perspective of what a school of architecture might be and what role it might play in the wider professional and cultural context of a postmodern world. The AA's main outputs were not technical plans and sections for realizable buildings, but concept studies, design manifestos, evocative drawings, such as the ones you can see on this slide. I remember how we dismissed all this as paper architecture when I studied at ETH in the 1990s, completely oblivious to the fact that paper architecture was precisely the point of it all. The AA's primary aim was not to feed graduates into the stale British building industry, but to contribute to a global discourse on architecture by exploring and recharting its disciplinary boundaries. This was Boyarski's legacy. His complete control over the AA and the longevity of his tenure ensured that much of this legacy persists today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for this lecture. Before we go to the discussion, I wanted to ask you, because you send also this image of Boyarski on an elephant as the emblematic image. So do you want to tell us just a few words about what was happening there? What kind of event? Because I think it's...
Yes, it basically, it was to celebrate the revival of the AA carnivals, which had a very long history in the AA school, and had always been an event that gave students, gave them an opportunity to dress up and celebrate and perform plays, but it also gave them an opportunity to kind of take the mickey out of their teachers by having pantomime. So that was a long history and a famous history of the AA school, which was cancelled at some point. And in 1976, it was decided to revive this, and Boyarski used the opportunity for a characteristically spectacular presentation of himself riding on this elephant, dressed up as an explorer towards the AA. So that's the background of this picture, which is a very famous picture of the 70s AA.
Thank you very much. So before opening to students also, because I think it would be good for them to ask questions and also link all we saw today to the rest of the lecture we had in the pro seminar. But just as a sort of conclusion, or to see something that linked the 3 talks or the 4 talks that we had today, I think it's great because we had a wide panorama of the landscape of the 1960s and 70s, of how discourse was shaped by institutions in Milan, in Rotterdam, in London. And of course, what links all the stories that we heard today is the notion of crisis and the notion of redefinition of the institution. Patrick, you said that the AA was different because it's obviously an institution that has a much longer history. but it's also, I could say the same, for example, if I talk about the Venice Biennale, but in those years, all these institutions obviously redefine themselves, whether they are, just emerging or they are, coming from a longer history. And of course, in this phase of transformation and reorganization, there is something that Federica said that I think is quite key here. What architecture is, or what architecture should be, or as you say, Patrick, what is school of architecture should be. So I think these institutions are, in the end, all trying to answer that very simple or difficult question. And at the same time, trying to foster more transatlantic, or I wouldn't say global, because of course we know that global at the time was another thing that global is today, but at least transatlantic network and discussion. So it's not really a question, but it's more something that tries to link your three talks together. So I don't know if any of you wants to react on that, on this notion of crisis, just as a first discussion point. Any volunteer?
Well, I was tempted to kind of respond with another question, which kind of picks up this international dimension, but I don't really want to.
No, go ahead.
I was kind of struck by two contrasting images in Federica's talk, which kind of, one was that picture of, I believe it was 1960, of that committee or organizers meeting of all these, which kind of assembled in a very narrow room, the great and good of Italian architecture, Zanuso, De Carlo, Gardella, Roches. And then roughly a decade later, the other image, which showed these exhibition panels at the Triennale with Isozaki, Archigram, Hollein, Woods, which kind of has this strong international dimension, which is kind of what I associate with the Triennale. And I was kind of wondering when this kind of shift happened, because the other institutions that we looked at, I think they seem to have this international dimension. Certainly in the period that we discussed them, I was just kind of struck by that contrast. Is there kind of a point where can you identify a shift when this happened and why it happened?
Well, this is a great question. And perhaps is also linked to this idea of crisis. Because of course the Triennale starts as a fair, no? So you link the first Triennale, especially in Monza, to the international fairs, and so you have a number of countries that are presenting their own pavilion, but this is also gives, I think, a dimension that the Triennale as a fair, as a turn into museum Triennale, as a space of bureaucratic or as international contacts and in a way of dealing with, for instance, with the international crisis as the Cold War. For instance, we haven't talked about this, but there is an exhibition in 1951, which at that time the president of the Triennale was the person that also negotiated the Marshall Plan. Was a minister of foreign affairs, and so he one of the documents that I found is he's very happy about the fact that the US has been willing to participate in the Triennale. So yes, it's international, of course, from the very beginning for the way in which was set up. But as you said, Patrick, in the very end, this internationality does not really translates into an openness of decisions. On the opposite, there are very, very few players here that are part of the decision making. And perhaps like really the one that opens more on an international stage is precisely the 68, where all these architects from everywhere, and thanks to De Carlo, because it's part of the Team 10. So yeah, so maybe I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Do we have a question from the room? Anyone? Yes. Sorry, maybe you start, Raymond, because you're here.
Okay.
Yeah, and then you can come after. I think it's better if you come in front of the camera to ask your questions. Yeah, this hybrid format is a bit complicated. But yeah.
Thank you all for the wonderful presentations. I'm Raymond, and just to speak generally, this isn't really a question, but maybe just an idea to think about. Speaking about crises and institutional crises, we do see moments of great change where the institution will face a crisis and will have to either transform or adapt itself in many of the cases discussed today, or it will collapse and fall in the case of the IAUS. But I'd like to talk about the significance, if at all, of a name, because it seems that we sort of take for granted that the AA has existed under its same name for so long, whereas these other institutions like the Triennale, it faced a crisis, and let's say the spirit of the Triennale was transformed and moved into another institution, or the two or three Dutch institutions contributed and led into the NIE. But I was wondering about the significance of the fact that we still call the AA, and how that affects the way we talk about it and look back at the institution because of its continuity of the name. I was wondering if anyone had any thoughts on that. Thank you.
You mean that there are many phases in the history of the school, and yet we have the same name for the school all along?
I can say something. It actually relates to the international comments that Patrick and Federica were just discussing. So the NAI, the name was actually very, very important, not only because it meant that it was an institute rather than a museum, because I go into it in the book, but basically the institute was expected to do more than a museum. So not just be reflective or document what existed, but also project forward and develop sort of an architectural culture. But perhaps even more interesting than that is that the NAI from the very beginning chose the title of Netherlands Architecture Institute so that it could be, you could use the same acronym both in Dutch and in English. So there was this international dimension that was considered and actually very much orchestrated from the beginning, to such an extent that, so currently there exists a publisher called NIE 010. It used to be the NAI was an independent publisher that was associated with the Institute. And the publishers from that publishing house, when I was talking to him, interviewing him for the book, I asked him what was going on with the two languages. And he was almost apologetic to having to use the Dutch because they only wanted to use the English, because their intention was to really have an international vocation. So this to say that the name was very purposeful. Also in this specific case of the NAI, the name, so that the lack of continuity from one of the two or even the three institutions was purposeful, so that it wouldn't be that one institution was absorbing the other, but that they together were creating something new. So the name was actually very symbolic. Also, just sort of as a continuity for it, in 2010, 2011, when the NAI opens again after it was closed for a renovation, it presents itself as the NAI Museum for Architecture, because they had done some sort of polling, and they realized that no one really understood what an institute was for, and what it was, which audience could visit it. So they considered that calling it a museum would be more straightforward, but the name was very important.
And it also changed names since, no?
Well, it changed the institution. Now it's called a new institute.
Yeah, I don't know exactly the.
No, it's called a new institute because the NAI officially disappeared. It was merged with three other institutions, in fact, and it was created the new institute. So it merged with an institute for electronic culture, an institute for graphic design, the Premsela, and some other interests in fashion. The big difference from the merger that I discussed and this merger that occurred to create the new institute was that the first one was intentional and intended by the people working in those institutions. The second one was forced by the government. And that's also, it's interesting that Patrick alluded to the need for funding and how that affected not only the crisis as it emerged in the AA, but how it affected the very innovation of the unit system at the AA. Because there's one point also in the story of the NAE that it seems that it becomes more about selling architecture or selling the idea of architecture than really developing and fostering a new or a more inclusive architectural discussion.
I wonder if I could just jump in about the name of the AA, which is quite an interesting point, really. AA is more than a name; it's a brand, and it's been seen as a brand for a very long time. So they were the Architectural Association. They are very conscious of their history, and it's funny that when that merger discussion was ongoing, one of the admittedly not major arguments against it, but it was an argument that was raised, was the idea of losing the name was totally unacceptable to the AA, because they saw the name AA as something that's worth more in British architecture than anything, including the RIBA, and so they are quite conscious. And to touch on the second point that was raised, there were shifts and breaks and ruptures in the history of the AA, but there is also great continuity in it, including across the Boyarski years. So Boyarski himself was very conscious of this traditional element in the AA and these kind of these institutional myths and customs that the AA developed, and he clearly and deliberately positioned himself as someone who picked up this revolutionary spirit of the founders of the AA and kind of continued this tradition. And there is as I said, there is a great continuity in institution because it is so hermetic and self-referential. So oftentimes people who study at the AA, they then teach at the AA, and sometime later they became counselors of the AA, and they kind of raised the next student generation. And so there is an actual personal continuity, even though it's more than 150 years old. There is kind of a sort of almost like a family tree that goes back to the founders in a way, and so they would never give up that name ever.
But what does change, Patrick, I don't know what your opinion is on this, but in terms of phases, but what does change at the AA is the name of the publication, right? You mentioned that there was a publication all the way since the beginning, and we saw this a little bit here in the seminar, but the publication changes from AQ to Arena to AA File, so that might perhaps mark some phases in the.
Very much so, yeah, and again, very deliberately so by Boyarski, who completely remodeled and restaged that whole publication program. The interesting thing about it is that the actual house journal of the AA which was the AA journal, and then Arena, and then AAQ. That was the only thing that kind of was left within the remit of the association rather than himself and the school. And that was the only thing that didn't make any money, basically. So it was one more way to kind of show how successful the school is and how irrelevant the association. And that kind of strategy runs through the entire Boyarski operation at the AA. He did this with everything. So everything that kind of was not successful was kind of sold as part of the association, and everything that was kind of striking and attracted students, that was all the school. It's quite interesting. And the publication program is kind of part of this strategy as well.
Yeah, because for example, you mentioned the AA 125 exhibition, and this was very much focused on education part of the AA, right? And that's what he also goes around and publicized all over the world with this traveling exhibition, right?
Yeah, but that exhibition was planned before he came. What he did was he took charge of it and turned it into an advertisement campaign, basically.
Exactly.
It wasn't the first travel exhibition of this sort either. There had been one in the 50s and one in the 60s that traveled just as widely, but they were purely for information and to kind of look, we got school, but not to actually attract students. Under Boyarski, that was completely different.
Thank you. Sebastian had a question as well.
Yes, can you hear me from here?
No, I don't think so.
No, we can.
Come closer.
Hi there. Thank you for the lovely presentations. They were a very nice summarization. I had a thought regarding Patrick, your presentation of the AA and its institutional presence. Not institutional, its presence within discourse, specifically in England, and the teaching methodologies that it brought forward, such as the competitive unit system and the open crit, etc. And I'm sure that the other institutions which were calling the AA's work paper architecture and kind of criticizing the work that was being produced eventually adopted some of these learning techniques. Could you speak about kind of how long this process took of almost realizing that, how big was this gap whereby institutions finally admitted that these learning kind of methods were working? And maybe also the pictures kind of painted that the AA kind of stands on top of everyone else. Like, was there any sort of event or instance where another institution really provided a substantial confrontation to their teaching methodologies?
Two really good, very rich questions. Just to kind of preface my answer, interestingly enough, the AA had a great impact on an international discourse, but I think I would question that it actually had much of an impact in Britain. Certainly not in the 70s. Possibly not in the 80s. So it's spread wider before it spread narrower in a way. As to when it actually started to affect other schools, it's kind of difficult to answer. It originally happened through people like Peter Cook, who took up professorship or headships at other schools at the Bartlett Columbia. So they kind of took their measures there and implemented them there, and they were successful and widely published. And yes, we dismissed it at paper architecture, but we did know what they were doing. So there certainly was a bit of jealousy involved in this response. And frankly, when I studied at ETH, we had a unit system. So by then that was in the 1990s. So by then it had, I would say by the time it spread to ETH, it probably spread to everywhere else as well, because they weren't exactly keen on taking lessons from the AA. So yeah, I can't give you an exact timetable. I would think it's pretty gradual, but pretty quickly, because the kind of presence that the AA had beyond, I mean, you know, how do you get a presence as a school of architecture? No one's really that interested in, you know, what schools of architecture do, and kind of to bring yourself or to position yourself in a kind of wider discourse is quite special, and I would think quite unique. I mean, there were of course other great schools of architecture and that made important contributions, but certainly none that had that international profile. I would doubt there is one now. So I hope this answers your questions.
Thanks.
I have a question, a bit the same question as I asked to Kim, I would like to ask to you. So coming back a little bit to the method of your research, that all happened more or less, as I said before, at the same time, when the, you know, protagonists of your stories mostly were, well, maybe a bit less Federica, but were still there. And so I wanted to ask you about oral history and how it informed your research. And if you would have, because the students have in pairs, they have to all perform an interview. So if you have any, so it's a double question. How did oral history inform your research? And if you have any advice to give in terms of, you know, going about and interviewing people on recent history.
Is that for me or for?
That's for all three of you. So anyone who wants to reply, it's for everybody. Maybe, I don't know, Patrick, if you want to start.
I'm happy to, yeah. It's kind of my research, basically, it's based very heavily on archival research and fairly heavily on oral history. And the two kind of complement each other, but not easily. And I think one has to be quite careful, particularly at the AA. So in a way, I used oral history not so much to kind of generate a narrative or a sort of an understanding of the institution, because the whole institution is kind of based on oral history. So it has all these myths and half-truths and things that it generally believes in, that are kind of not questions within the AA, but once you look at the institutional records, it gives a different perspective. So it's in a way almost the archive records in a way challenge or kind of rectify some of the kind of pitfalls of oral history. On the other hand, with institutions, and particularly with educational institutions, not a lot of education is largely a thing that happens verbally in personal interaction. So not everything important that happens in a school of architecture leaves a written trace somewhere. So it's kind of, I used oral history often to kind of to get an idea of important events that happened beyond the archive, and finding things that once I knew they were happening, I did find kind of traces of it in the archive, but in a much more neutral form. So it's kind of, I think oral history was indispensable for me, but I did find it very difficult to kind of, it's very, especially with the AA, where, as I said, it's kind of an ongoing process with the AA. So people are still, even people talking about the 70s, they're not unbiased. They still very much have an agenda that they push, not all of them, but quite a few of them. And it's kind of, one has to be quite careful to just take what they say as the gospel truth. But still, I found it invaluable, and I love doing it. It's very time consuming, but I mean, you learn things that you can't learn in any other way. But I do think it's good if one can corroborate the findings generally.
I think it's very important what you say about the archive, and this is also something that we've talked about here in the seminar. And this, you know, one cannot go without the other. So how the oral history and the archive work together, and what's the timing of? I think, was it Kim that also mentioned something about, you know, looking at the archive and then doing interview and then going back to the archive. So this kind of going, and, you know, this movement between the archive of and the oral history is very a delicate, you know, balance.
Totally agree.
Yeah. And maybe, I don't know, Sergio, if you want to, I mean, you also did a lot of interview, right, for your history of the.
Yes, that's correct. I did a lot of interviews. A bit like Patrick, I also always took everything with a grain of salt, because everyone always has an agenda, always want to be remembered in a specific way. But it was in this interaction between the written archive and the oral history that really the story came together. I think that, just to complement, because I agree with everything you said, Patrick, just to complement it, when I look back at the interviews, or I haven't heard them in a while, but when I look back at the interviews, I remember thinking that my first interviews, I was very naive. And I was sort of taking almost their word for it. So I couldn't contest what they were saying, right? So I just sort of drank up whatever they were telling me. By my later interviews, it was the exact opposite. I was able to, after having been to the archives, after having talked to other people, to question them a bit more directly on whatever it was that they were telling me. And I think that made for much richer conversations and interviews than my early ones, which was mostly monologues, really. Mm-hmm. Towards the end, there was a back and forth of me understanding exactly what they were talking about, and sometimes contesting what they were saying, sometimes corroborating with what I had found in the archives.
Yeah, did you had instances where you confronted people with
yes
of evidence? Because we also here work with evidence in the interview. So
yes. For example, the episode I mentioned about the OMA story. So I can tell this is a very funny story, because I talked to 2 or 3 people from the Institute, and they were very open about it. It was almost like an open secret. Oh, everyone knew about it, you know? And then the first time I tried to publish something about it, and it was not even focused on it, it was just sort of something that I mentioned in passing. The editor went ballistic. It's like, what is this? No one knows about this. How could this be? You know, a public institution supporting a private architectural office. Would they do this for everyone? How would they do it? And at that moment, it was very useful that I had, let's say, the archival proof, like the receipts from OMA, the discussion going back and forth between the NAI people and the OMA people. So that was not with an interview, but there were other interviews that people were sort of painting a very rosy picture of what they had done or tried to do. And after having knowledge of what was in the archive, as Patrick mentions, a sort of more neutral view and sometimes a bit more systematic view, you know, like I had access to the minutes of board meetings and things like that, in which everything was really discussed. There was only one thing I couldn't find there, which is really, it was very bizarre. The minutes would say, and now we are going to discuss the decision for the building, so no more minutes will be taken. It was a very contested decision. But it was really more with what you would find in the archive than what you had heard from other people, that you could confront and contest what people were telling you. But there were certainly instances towards the end that I did that. I had to do that, because otherwise you end up with just sort of one version of the story, not only, and sometimes it's not by, let's say, a purposeful intent, it's just that's what they remember. And then when you say, oh, but did this and this and that, didn't that also happen? They're like, oh yes, you are right, these were connected, something like that.
It's totally agree with, and just when you mentioned your earliest interviews as compared to the later ones, it's exactly the same with me. And with my interviews, I think one of the problems as well when you kind of start to do oral history interviews is that you interview someone and you have a certain expectation of what they can deliver for you. Not in detail, but you approach someone for a particular reason, and you hope to get something out of it. And personally, when I listen to my early interviews, there's a lot of leading involved, where I try to lead my interview partners down the path that I want them to go down. And I think that's there's a danger there to kind of falsify then, or kind of to trigger memories that they don't actually really have, but that they kind of confirm just to, because they're nice people and want to, don't want you to have come in vain. So I kind of noticed that in my earlier interviews, and then the later one's much better, where you kind of, you let them speak, you set sort of broad benchmarks and then kind of let them go with it. But it's quite difficult, I think, to interview people. I mean, I've done dozens now, but I still think it is quite challenging.
Yeah, yes, maybe the ideal with a lot of time with such a big project as a PhD is to interview twice, to go once at the beginning and once later in. I mean, of course, it's not always possible, but I guess that's the best, because you have to start by something, right? So
yes, but it's a bit like what Patrick is saying as well. It's also a lot about the preparation you have beforehand. And how you structure let's say the main points you would like to discuss. But there's also a lot of it that is just seeing where the conversation goes. Because often you will find really interesting things that you hadn't even considered or knew about, just from what the conversation, how the conversation develops.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so my experience is to go with a set of questions. So here in the class, we have to, each group will go with 10 questions, but I think it's good to have those, but also to not hesitate to diverge from these questions at some point, depending where the conversation goes.
So have the students carried out any interviews yet?
Not yet. They will carry them in December. So we are now in the phase of choosing, who we will interview and contact them and writing the questions. And so it will be 12 interviews, and we're trying to, not in each cases, but in many cases, they will interview people from their countries, because there's a lot of obviously international students. So we're trying also to kind of map a little bit institutions or architects or publication outside of the canons, let's say. So we have some students from Mexico and from Asia and from the US and etc. So we're trying to also have new people and not just the usual suspect, let's say. Federica, I don't know how much you use oral history, and if you had anything to add to what was already said, or.
Well, as you said, I deal with a lot of people that are not here anymore. Yeah. I had my interviews, but it's almost like my main archival resource are transcriptions of dialogues.
It's true, yeah.
And so for me was the reverse problem, how to give life to something that has gone through the process of being transcribed, but not by me. But also perhaps like as a follow-up question, and I was thinking while you were talking now, what is the different role of the archive, but also of all these institutions that are creating their own archive, and how curated is this archive. And I was struck about, for instance, Sergio, that was talking about, the institution, the NIE, was developed out of an archive. And while he was talking, I was thinking, was this archive curated in a sense that so certain things that were they thought that they should have been like really the foundation of this new institution, and others that were less interesting or less important. And also with Patrick, I was thinking, of course, the control room, which is the the magic room of the AA, but also the staging of the crits. So it seems now is material for archive, whether it was archive or not, but it seems so. And so I was thinking, and I was thinking that in reflection to what happens to the Triennale, because the first archive that was really set was very late in the 1973. The first exhibition that talks about the history of the institution is actually then. Of course, things have been collected, things dispersed and forgotten, and voluntarily also forgotten, because there is the fascist part of the Triennale and of course of Italy. So there were very selected memory. So I was thinking about, but then also how that reflects in the Triennale, in the sense that there is the idea of the architect that is not a militant architect anymore, but has to deal with the history, or at least has to confront history. So I was curious how this reflects in your institutions, this idea of the architect, the militant architect, or the architect that the history of architecture, the history of our discipline, and how that relates to the self narrative now.
Well, I can tell you that at the NIE, so because there were like two parts in that archive, right? So first you were asking how curated the archive was, and then you were talking about the archive of the Triennale. I can tell you that when I started my research, no one really had an idea of what was in the archive, or the institutional archive of the NIE. So much so that they asked me to sign like a non-publication agreement, and I said, what's the point of conducting a PhD if you cannot publish it? I'm not going to sign it, because they had no idea what was in it, right? So the current director had no idea what was there, what type of information. They had no overview. So it was pretty much uncurated. It was also uncatalogued, meaning that you could not just directly have access to it. You had to go through the institution. So that's the part of the institutional archive. But the idea of pieces of the archive that were collected and some pieces of the archive that were not collected, it was always a focus of the NIE, much like the CCA, to collect complete archives. So with the notion that what's not valuable today might become valuable tomorrow. But of course, in any process of collecting, there is a selection procedure. So that is inevitable. But they try to be as open as possible. And that it was actually a reversal of a collection policy in 2012, when they decided to, instead of collect full archives, collect very specific elements. About the activist architect, that is something that I'm still surprised in relation to the NIE, how the architectural community did not sort of rally around the NIE when it was condemned to become the new institute. Because it seemed that it was just taken for granted that there was this infrastructure that supported Dutch architecture and therefore would be there forever, when it wasn't. So that is sort of a bizarre question for me, that there wasn't more activism, like a Boyarski figure emerging from the ruins and saying, no, let's do something about this, which was in fact very much what happened in the first merger. Because now we're talking about the NIE and we're talking about Rotterdam. But if you've noticed, all the institutions I mentioned, they were based in Amsterdam. Mm. So at one point, the minister said, we will only give you funding for this that you want to do if you move to Rotterdam. And they said, well, thank you very much, we are not doing it. And there was a sort of a wrestle for years, but years and years and years, until they finally accepted to move to Rotterdam. Mm-hmm. So it's, sorry, I go on tangents, but but it's very rich in these sort of histories and stories that end up shaping very much how we end up knowing the institutions, a bit like what you've mentioned with the curating of the fascist period for the Triennale.
I think the question of the archive and how I faced the same thing with the Venice Biennale. The archive was actually closed when I started research, and I even hesitate to continue or not. And then it opened, but it was very much the beginning. So every time I went there was new material, so I couldn't really have an overview of what was there. And still I discovered that there were new things that I didn't see. So I think that's also where oral history was quite, essential, because we all had to work, I think, with archives that were in construction, as we were doing the research. So you have to, and also the other thing is that a lot of these institutions were writing their own history as well. So the Biennale is trying, and the CCA, for example, is also kind of engaged in, writing a history of their exhibitions. And so there is this as well that it's complicated. Any other questions from the audience here, the audience in presence? Because unfortunately, I realize that we cannot take questions from don't know if this live stream is working, but we cannot take questions from here, unfortunately. So any question from here? Quite a long day, maybe you're tired. Maybe I can just ask one question to Federica, also in the relation between, because today we talked about the Venice Biennale mainly, and then I mentioned a bit the Triennale and things that you also talked about, but you're saying that we will have more details later. But what is the relationship between those two? Because that's a very particular case where it's two institutions that are different, but they are geographically quite close. And I feel like there's also, in the 80s and 90s, the Biennale become more important, and the Triennale kind of lose its power in the sense. So I don't know if I don't know how much you've done research also in the following, in what happens, after in the 80s, which is also a period in which Milan was a really important city for design, in the 80s. It was like the boom years of Milan. But what happens at the Triennale?
Well, one thing that it's striking is the fact that the 1973 was the last Triennale, was a Triennale that was the 3 months, 2 months, lasting that period. And then there was a kind of moment of where there was no Triennale, and the next one was the 79. But the 79 is a particular one because it's between 79 and 81. So is a program of 3 years. And so in many ways, there is a different coordination. And there are incredible events within that Triennale. But in some way, does not have the intensity that had earlier, and so the Triennale starts to enter this space of rethinking about itself. Yes, the archive is starting to be analyzed at that point. So and in many ways, many other Triennales were kind of nobody heard about them. And now we are hearing about the Triennale again with the broken nature. And then there is another one that is for next year, which seems also extremely interesting. So in many ways, yes, I think that they're related in these two institutions, no? in the sense that when the Triennale is not as important, the Biennale instead acquires.
I feel like we shift because also now as you mentioned, the Triennale has a kind of rebirth, but the advantages of the Triennale over the Biennale is its size is much more manageable. And so perhaps we also discussed earlier themes and how, when these themes really of the exhibition, really have a relevance, because sometimes with the Biennale, they are so general and the exhibition is so big that they don't really create a discourse or an interesting discussion. But with the Milan Triennale, I feel like because it's smaller, that it has more potential for, so I feel like there's a shifting balance between those two. And their history is very much linked, as you say, as you know, you can't really talk about one without the other. So. Any other question? We're approaching 5 o'clock. I think everybody is tired, but it was nice to have time to really have a proper discussion between, unfortunately, Kim wasn't here, but between the three of you. Thank you very much for this contribution. I think it was very inspiring. And we will keep you posted on the follow-up and the work of the students in the next few months. So thank you very much. And
thank you for having us.
Thanks.
Good luck with your work.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.